Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Peter Parker's senior field trip led to Stark Industries. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. An inconspicuous black car began to pull up to the curb a block away from Midtown School of Science and Technology. With it being the beginning of a new school week, the students that walked by along the sidewalk were more sluggish in their pace than normal. Rather than pay attention to an average-looking car on the road, they were more focused on not stumbling due to their grogginess. Those same students continued to pay no attention to the vehicle as it finally came to a stop, and Peter Parker was all too thankful for that. Once the footway was briefly cleared, Peter hurriedly grabbed his backpack and opened the rear door of the car. He shuffled out, tossed out a quick, "Thanks Happy," to the man in the driver's seat, and firmly closed the door before hopping up the curb and joining the mass of students. Peter eventually slung his backpack over a shoulder and even jogged a few steps ahead, hoping to put a bit more distance between him and the car. It may have been a very simple thing to be worried about, but Peter was always embarrassed at the thought of someone spotting him getting out of the back of the vehicle. Teenagers usually sat up front where it made them feel older, yet Peter still sat in the back. He was technically being chauffeured around, so it made sense for the young adult to be there, but he always felt uncomfortable being pampered in such a way. Then again, it was Happy Hogan that tended to drop him off and pick him up. The older man was far from being Peter's personal chauffeur, and thus did not treat him like some pampered brat. But Tony Stark always insisted that Happy be the one to help Peter commute to school. The young hero was not completely sure why Mr. Stark always insisted, but Peter made sure that he regularly thanked both men whenever he was being taken back and forth between the Avengers Tower and his school. Peter was at least thankful that Happy did not take him every day. He only drove Peter back and forth at Tony's insisting. If Peter happened to be going to and from home, then Peter gladly took the bus or subway. And as usual, Happy's impeccable driving had Peter arriving to school on time with a few minutes to spare before the first bell rang. Arriving at the front gate, Peter stepped onto the school grounds with a sigh of relief at beating the bell. When he eventually made his way in and reached his locker, the teen was met by his best friend Edward, Ned Leeds. They greeted each other with one of their many nerd handshakes and easily ignored a few snickers from some girls nearby. Peter finally opened his locker and began picking out which textbooks he would be needing for the day. "Sup, Peter? How was your weekend?" Ned asked as he leaned against the wall of lockers. "Same old. Though I did learn a new trick from the web," Peter said with a cheesy grin as he tossed a look to the other teen. Ned gave his own grin in return and even let out a soft snicker. The two of them loved to talk about Peter and his secret identity, but knowing that they were in a building full of teenagers who loved nothing more than to eavesdrop on anything within earshot, the two friends had been quick to start talking in code. It was not much a secret code, but it still worked. Whenever they fell into such conversations, they always talked about the internet, or the web, as they called it, even if saying such a term was outdated. It was a play on words, and the two nerds loved using it, even though Aunt May and Mr. Stark had both rolled their eyes the day they each learned about the phrase. "Really?" Ned asked with an excited tone. "You'll have to show me later." "Of course I will. Promise." With that, Peter stuffed the last book into this backpack, slammed his locker shut, and the two headed for their first class just as the warning bell rang. Due to his senior status and because he was a student at one of the more technological schools in the New York area, Peter had a bit of a different schedule than other high schoolers. With Midtown having a more scientific focus to their studies, Peter and his fellow seniors were able to have a full class schedule dedicated to their field of study for the whole year. Granted, it only took up the second half of each school day, but it was quite the jump start to begin learning their field of study. In Peter's and Ned's case, they had a class that was 3 hours long that was dedicated to anything and everything about engineering. The class was a decent size with 15 students enrolled in total. It was by no means a large class, but neither was it small. It was, however, a class where everyone knew each other for better or worse. Most knew each other fairly well, if not on a first-name basis at least, and all were friendly with each other for the most part. That way, when the students had to present their projects or pair up during assignments, no one was a stranger to each other. The two friends had been looking forward to their senior year just so that they could finally take this 3-hour course, but had been disappointed to learn that a fellow student by the name of Eugene Flash Thompson was in the class as well. Flash had mellowed out slightly in all the years that Peter had unfortunately known him, but at his core, Flash was still an arrogant and selfish individual who believed himself to always be the smartest and greatest person in the room. When Peter and Ned arrived to the class after lunch, they were greeted by Flash at the door. "Well, look who it is," he said as he folded his arms and leaned against the doorway. "Flash," Peter mumbled a greeting, trying to get past the other. Flash shot an arm out to prevent Peter from entering the classroom. "Watch your tone there, penis. I could misinterpret how you said my name just then, you know. I might have to do something about that to make sure you don't get an attitude with me." Peter secretly rolled his eyes at those words but knew better than to say anything to antagonize the other any more than he already was. Ned stepped in then. "Come on, Flash. Move, will ya? We just want to get to our seats before Mr. Johnson gets here." "What was that, Dead? You should shut your trap or else I just might have to lump you in with your pal here." That was a nickname that Flash had dubbed Ned with. Ned the Dead. It was by no means creative nor funny, but neither Ned nor Peter were bothered by the name for that very reason. Ned was just about to give a retort but was stopped by a weathered hand resting on his shoulder. He, Peter, and Flash all looked to see Mr. Johnson standing behind Ned. Mr. Johnson was an older man that had white hair with the classic receding hairline. He was on the tall and thin side, with a chin hidden by a wispy beard. He was considered a fair teacher by most, who was both friendly with his students and strict with them if need be. "What seems to be going on here, gentlemen?" he asked the three of them with a curious look on his face, though his bushy eyebrows were lowered in suspicion. "Nothing, sir," Flash said as he quickly put his arm down that had been blocking the entrance to the classroom. "Just joking around." Peter kept quiet while Ned shook his head as he looked away. Mr. Johnson looked at all three of them with another expression on his face before he directed Ned towards the door with the hand that was still on the teen's shoulder. He looked towards Peter and Flash then, corralling all three of them into the classroom. "Well then, why don't you three grace us with your presence in the classroom so that I can get started teaching, All three gave a sheepish nod as they fell into their seats. A few classmates spared them a glance or two before everyone finally looked to the front of the room at the sound of Mr. Johnson dumping a stack of papers on his desk. Most knew the history between the three of them, so it was not surprising to see a few curious eyes taking a peek at them even after their teacher formally began class. "Good afternoon, class," the older man said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson," everyone said in varying degrees of volume. "Fur got an announcement to make." Students answered back with groans and moans. Whenever a teacher said those words, it usually meant that they were going to assign a project or something that included a presentation. Mr. Johnson's famous glare silenced the class right away. "As I was saying, I have an announcement. But don't worry, you young pupils, it is not something to torture your souls with. Instead, it is about this year's field trip, which will be in a few weeks. I believe that is something that would capture your interest?" Those words brought a few murmurs throughout the rows of students as they turned to one another, wondering where they might be going. Ned and Peter traded a grin at the thought of where their senior field trip might take them. Another stare and loud cough from their teacher had the class quieting down once more. "Well, apparently the school pulled a few strings, and it looks like we will be taking a tour of Stark Industries this year." The eager atmosphere in the room seemed to explode with excitement and anticipation about what they might see at the building in a few weeks' time. Talking soon filled the room, and Mr. Johnson's attempts at gaining their attention was lost as the young 18-year-olds were too lost in their thoughts. A fond smile fell on his face though as he saw how excited his students were at the news. Ned, holding his own excited grin, tuned to Peter. His smile shifted slightly at the state of his best friend. Peter was slumped over his seat with his forehead cupped in a palm. His other hand was occupied with the desk as a finger repeatedly tapped the surface, giving away how anxious he was. That was when Ned remembered what was exactly what his best friend did that would involve Stark Industries. "Hey Peter, you alright?" Ned whispered. "Huh? Oh, yeah. I guess I'm alright." "You guess? Well, it's just weird. I'm going to be taking a field trip to a place that I go to at least 3 times a month. And that's not if I am on the web." "Yeah, I get it. But you've never gotten to see everything, right? Try think of it that way. If we get to take a formal tour of the place, maybe you'll get to do and see things that he probably doesn't think to show you." Peter lifted his head at those words. His eyebrows shifted around in consideration until a smile finally grew on his face. "Dude, you're right. At least maybe I can do something that I haven't done there before." Another thought came to Peter, however, and the smile slipped from his face again. "But what about everyone there? What if we run into them or they crash the party and do something embarrassing?" Ned gave a weak shrug at that, having no answer. There was a pause in their talking though, as they made sure that the room was still buzzing with conversation before they continued speaking. No one had been listening to them speak, and the both were thankful for that at least. "What about if you just don't tell everyone that you'll be there for a school thing?" "Huh, that might work. Worth a shot, right?" "Right." Peter gave a nod to end their discussion, and right then, Mr. Johnson was finally able to gain everyone's attention to finally start the class for the day. The 3-hour class seemed to pass in a breeze, and with the last few minutes before the final bell for the day was to ring, Mr. Johnson handed the permission slips out to every student, with the obvious reminder that if the slip was not signed by a parent or a guardian, they would not be able to attend the tour. "Don't forget that they need to be signed, and I would prefer for them to be handed in no later than next Friday. Don't wait until the last minute, you hear? We need to be able to know who will and will not be going ahead of time." Mr. Johnson said those last words on the matter, and with that, the end of the school day arrived, and the final bell let the students start to filter out of the building. Peter and Ned found themselves walking back to their lockers to store their books for the day. "This is exciting, huh, Peter?" "I guess so," Peter said with a shrug, "if you, know, aren't there almost every other week." "Yeah, I guess you're right. But can't you at least be excited for me?" Ned asked with a crooked smile on his face as he filled his locker. Peter smiled back. "Of course, I am. It's just now I'm probably going to be overthinking this trip and be worried non-stop." "Why would you be worried? Dude, you should be freaking happy. Now you can prove to Flash that you really are an intern there. Plus, I thought I just told you in class that you don't need to be telling everyone at the tower what's going on." "I agree with not telling them, Ned, but I'm still not technically an intern. I just do stuff on the web with them," Peter reminded the other. His eye grew large at the realization. "Oh, right." Peter gave a small laugh and a shake of his head at the antics of best friend. The two of them then closed their lockers and made their way to the front of the school. Once outside, the friends spotted Flash leaning against the front step railings. He spotted them as well and gave a leer and mocking wave. "Hey there, penis. Thought I might get the chance to see you before my ride got here," Flash said as he tried to look casual, leaning against the rough brick rails. "What happened to your car? Finally crash it?" Ned asked. "Ha, ha. Real funny there, dead. Real funny. It had to get a checkup if you must know. Just waiting for my butler to come and get me." Peter and Ned rolled their eyes simultaneously, and even if Flash noticed the look, he said nothing as the apparent car he had been waiting for arrived. Instead of heading to the car right away, Flash turned back to the friends to say his piece. "Anyways, Parker, I thought it would be fun for you to realize that with us taking this field trip, I get to out you for being a liar about being an intern to Tony Stark." "Flash, I never said I was an intern to Mr. Stark. I just said that I was an intern at Stark Industries. There's a difference." "Whatever. I know what you were really trying to say when you first told us that lie. Either way, we'll get to see the truth in 3 weeks. Later." With that, Flash jumped from the wall he had leaned against and headed for the car. He slipped inside the front passenger door, causing Peter to chuckle lightly at the comparison of what Peter had went through just this morning. The smile faded, however, at the realization of Flash's words. As much as he would never say it out loud, Flash was right. Once they were at Stark Tower for the tour, Flash might try everything to get the lie to come out. There was a whole bunch of things that would go wrong with this field trip that would affect Peter for better or worse. He gave a sigh at those thoughts, as well as seeing the black car that he had begun to easily recognize. Looks like Mr. Stark wanted him at the tower for the evening. "Looks like I just got a ride too," Peter said as he turned to Ned. "Sorry about that. I promise to come to your house tomorrow, okay?" "Yeah, I get it. Have fun being all hero why. But you better keep that promise, Pete, or else I'll get May to make me cookies and you will get nothing." Laughing at those words but knowing they were 100% true, Peter shuffled his backpack higher up his shoulder as he walked down the school's front steps and entered the back door that Happy held open for him. He still did not like having a door be open for him. He could easily do that himself. Peter was, however, happy to note that he and Ned had been one of the last students to leave the school, meaning that there were not a lot of people around to see Peter get into a mysterious car like he had. As they began making their way towards the tower, Peter remembered to take out his phone to text May the change of plans. He had forgotten one time and had gotten an earful for a good hour when he finally made it home that day. Peter spent that evening as Spider-Man, helping Iron Man and Black Widow do a small stunt somewhere in East Ain't Big. But Peter had been all too happy to be included in it as a fellow hero. When they finally got back to the tower, it was so late that it was nearing early morning. Before he planned to head home, Peter decided to ask Tony about the field trip and see if he had known about it ahead of time. "Oh, that? Of course I did, kid," Tony said with a casual tone as he settled onto one of the many couches in the tower's main living room. He rested an arm across the back and patted it in invitation for Peter to join him. "Mr. Stark, why would you do that to me?" Peter whined as he flopped down nearby. "My poor teenage self-esteem is going to be ruined because of this trip. I know you. If you're there, you're going to try and embarrass me at any chance you get. First of all, Spider-Boy, I can't believe I still have to remind you to call me Tony even after 2 years." Peter half-heartedly said he wasn't Spider-Boy, but Tony ignored him and continued, "And second, I do not embarrass you." "Oh, yes you do, Tony. Not a lot, I can admit, but I know that if I show up here as some regular kid on a school tour looking fascinated by all your fancy technology, that you'll try your hardest to tease me. It's either that or you're just going to walk right up to me in the middle of trip and saying something to out me as an intern here, which, by the way, we both know is just a front." "Wait, what?" Tony interrupted as he gave a faint frown in what Peter assumed was confusion. What?" Peter asked in reply, not knowing what the other was specifically referring to. "That last thing you just said, Peter. You're not my intern?" "Well, last time I checked, no I wasn't. Not technically at least. I'm not trying to bring this up now so that I can be one. I was just talking about how that was a lie we came up with so that I could go with you to Germany. It's the alibi we've used ever since then, ya know." "Oh, I guess you're right on that one. Huh, well maybe we should fix that," Tony said with a satisfied and confident smile on his face as he relaxed once more into the couch. "Wait, really? Well, why the hell not? You do the work that the other interns do. You probably do it better too, and you do hero stuff on top of it. If anyone deserves the position, it's you, Peter." "Really, Mr. Stark? That would be totally awesome if you did that. But I don't want to be one of those people that tried to nag you about something and you just do it to shut them up and not really mean it and—" "Okay there, Pipsqueak," Tony interrupted the rambling as he put a hand on Peter's shoulder to calm him down. "There you go again, calling me Mr. Stark. And what are you talking about, Pete? You're one of the most kind and earnest kids I know. You have a good head on your shoulders, and giving you the actual job as my intern won't really change anything anyways. It's not like I'm going to make you work with other people. You're stuck with me, kid." The smile that Peter gave Tony at those words was blinding. Though they were far and in between, Peter occasionally tried to hug Tony in appreciation for what the teen would consider a big deal. Finally having an internship at Stark Industries was one of those big deals. Peter did not see it, being shorter than the older man and thus tucked underneath Tony's chin, but the genius gave an open smile of his own. Letting his head rest atop Peter's, he happily reciprocated the embrace that the younger hero started. "And don't you worry about doing all that boring paperwork," Tony said after he was released from the hug. "You mean the internship papers that I should fill out? Yeah. I'll get it handled. We both don't want to waste precious hours filling out all that garbage when we can actually be doing stuff that would be defined as internship work." Peter gave an excited giggle at that. "Did you just call your own internship program garbage?" "First of all, yes I did, but second, I was only talking about the paperwork, you little punk. I know you know what I meant. You should start heading out of here, kid. Don't want you losing any more sleep than you already have tonight. Going all the way to Canada and back all in one night is exhausting for anyone, but you're a teenager who should be getting at least 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night. You really think I get that much sleep on my own? I doubt you did when you were my age." "Yeah, but I'm an adult now, so that means you have to listen to my words of wisdom, and I say go to sleep." A yawn seemed to escape Peter then, as though knowing it could be known now. "Yeah, okay, fine. Say hey to Pepper for me, will ya?" He got up from the couch and headed to the elevator where his backpack was sitting. "Sure thing, kid." Tony got up to follow the teen as Peter got in the elevator to head back down to the employee parking lot. "Should I get Happy to take you back?" "Nah, I got this. I like to take the subway sometimes." Tony gave a hesitant nod before he finally bid the Spider Lane good night and the elevator doors closed. When Peter eventually got home around 1:30 in the morning, he found his aunt with crossed arms and frown. She gave him an earful as said her piece about how she was not pleased to see her nephew come home so late on a school night. Once she vented her anger, however, May still made sure to greet him with a kiss on the cheek and warm hug as usual. He eventually told her the good news and May gave a grin and gave her nephew another hug with a surprising amount of strength. With greater strength on his side, Peter easily lifted his aunt to spin her in a small circle before putting her down. An eager grin overtook his youthful face at her reaction to the news. "I am so happy for you, Peter. Becoming an intern for SI was something that you had always dreamt about. I know back then, when Mr. Stark first came here, it was a lie for my sake, but now knowing that you got the real deal is priceless. I can only hope that this will open a lot of doors for you into so many different careers and opportunities. Thanks, Aunt May. You have no idea how much it means for me to hear you say stuff like that." "Oh, Peter," she said as she cupped his cheek in her hand, "I love you like my own. I know you know that, but sometimes I feel like I need to remind myself. I know your parents would be happy with where you are and what you're doing. And Ben, goodness, he would probably have a field day with this news. You know him in technology. He couldn't tell the difference between a phone and a television remote. But I know he would be just as proud of you that you finally became an intern to the one place you really wanted to be." Peter placed his own hand atop hers. "Thank you," he whispered. May wiped the single tear that had escaped, and she gave him another tight hug which he eagerly fell into. With the tender moment past, Peter remembered the other event that had happened earlier at school. He fished out the permission slip for the field trip and showed it to her with a silly grin on his face. May gave her own laugh at the inside joke. She signed it with a wink to Peter, reminding him to behave and to make a good first impression at such an important place. Peter laughed along with her. He thanked her for signing the paper regardless, and after that, the 3 weeks leading up the trip seemed to pass by in the blink of an eye. The week of the field trip eventually arrived and the week itself seemed to pass by in a breeze until finally, it was Friday. Since their high school was specifically dedicated to the sciences, it was determined that all seniors would be able to take the field trip at the same time. Each class would simply be touring different parts of the tower at the same, overlooked by their teacher and a guide. Peter and Ned were even more thankful to be in the same class together, for it meant that they were in the same group. It was unfortunate, however, that their third friend, Michelle, MJ, Jones, was in a different class and thus a different tour. The three were glad to learn that grouping for lunch, so it was one positive thing to look forward to in the middle of the day-long tour. Those thoughts and plans were a long way off, however, as it was only the beginning of the day and Peter and his fellow classmates were still currently on school grounds. The first bell rang like usual and the seniors of Midtown High School loitered around the side of the premises where the buses arrived every morning and evening to drop off and pick up students. The buses were being used for another purpose today and thus were still running, ready to take the excited seniors to their destination. Eventually, all the teachers and volunteer chaperones arrived and began splitting off the classes by attendance sheets to make sure that everyone accounted for. Once that was out of the way, the students were then separated and directed to the various buses, which were soon filled with talkative and loud students who were very excited to be away from school for a day. Field trips were always a treat for students no matter how old they were, and everyone seemed to be even rowdier considering the destination. A few minutes later, the school buses finally departed and headed off towards the Stark Industries Tower. The tower was quite a ways away, yet for most of the ride, the looming building could always be seen in the distance, keeping the students excited and curious. Peter and Ned had managed to steal a seat closer to the back of the bus, and for the first couple of minutes they were lost in their own little world as they watched a few videos on Peter's phone. They were interrupted when a head peeked over the seat in front of them and the two were greeted to the sight of Flash staring down at them with a nasty smile plastered across his face. Ned gave a groan once he realized who it was that interrupted them, while Peter let out a soft sigh. Flash must have heard Ned because he glared at the teen before he turned back to Peter, clearly having picked his victim for the day. "So, Penis, want to tell us anything about the place before we get there? You are an intern after all." Giving a sigh at the realization that this ride might be longer than he previously thought, Peter replied, "Not really, Flash. I've never taken a tour of the place." "No tour, huh? Wouldn't it make sense for new interns to take a tour of the place so that they know what's up? Like, letting the newbie learn the ropes so that they don't burn the place down. How come you lucked out then?" "I don't know, Flash. Why don't you ask Mr. Stark himself?" "Wow, Parker, growing a backbone, are you? Or are you just trying to make your fake job seem more real by trying to dodge such an easy question? Hate to say it, but it looks to me like you're making it all up like usual." Peter gave a sigh. "For the last time, Flash, I am not lying about the internship. I don't know why you think I am." "Oh, come on, there's just no way someone like you would be able to get in. I mean, there were probably so many other applicants. There is no way that you beat them all." "Yeah, well I did." Peter mumbled the lie, already tired from arguing with Flash. He slumped back in the seat, hitting his head against the soft backing, hoping for Flash to give up once he realized that Peter wasn't going to be baited this time. His luck was with him this time, as Flash did eventually get bored and turned back around to sit forward in his seat. Peter snuck a glance to the seat across the aisle and saw two girls from their class looking at him. They were looking at one another, but Peter could tell from the tilt of their heads that they had obviously been listening in and believed what Flash had said. When one noticed that they had been caught, she leaned forward to say something to the other girl and they began talking softly to each other. Peter slumped down further in his seat as he gave another sigh. Ned gave him a nudge to the shoulder and a sympathetic look. Conversations continued to fill the bus for most of the ride after that, but as time went by and they got closer to their destination, Mr. Johnson finally spoke up, gaining their attention once he borrowed the bus radio. "All right, students, settle down for a minute, please." Most of them listened at those words, but there were still a few who either did not hear him or ignored him. One of those was Flash, and he was even called out and personally asked to be quiet. Peter and Ned were happy to quietly laugh at that. "Thank you," Mr. Johnson spoke again. "I just wanted to remind you students that taking this tour is a privilege which can be taken away. I do not want to see any of you being disrespectful to the tour guide or anyone else that might want to speak with us. You are to listen to and obey any rules that are asked of you. No touching anything without permission and no goofing off. I would very much like to be the fun teacher, since I am sure all of us are excited to be here. So please, just be on your best behavior. That shouldn't be hard, should it? After all, you folks are seniors now. You are either almost or already or 18 years old, meaning that you are adults now. I sure hope I can expect fellow adults to have common sense, right?" Very much intimated by the small speech, the bus was quiet. The only proof that everyone had been listening and understood what Mr. Johnson had just said were all 15 students quickly nodding their heads. "Good," Mr. Johnson said with a smile. Once he sat back down, it was not much longer until the bus was only a block away from Stark Industries. The tower took up most of their view, even blocking some of the neighboring skyscrapers. Chatter started up once again as the energy in the bus grew exponentially. Every student simply could not wait to step inside the place and tour of the grand building. When the bus is finally parked, everyone was eager to hop out to stretch their legs and get a better look at the building. Groups of friends huddled together as they pointed and ogled at the decorated plaza that was built in front of the tower. Conversations and laughter got louder and louder as the other buses caught up and soon let their own students out as well. Try as they might, teachers and chaperones lost the battle of keeping the classes and groups separate when students soon intermingled to meet up with friends. The same could be said for Peter and Ned as they were chatting about the makeup of the tower when MJ snuck up behind them. Her steps were quiet, and she easily spooked them when she whispered, "Boo." The two jumped at the sound and MJ let an easygoing laugh escape before she shifted her face to look indifferent once more. When Peter and Ned turned around to face her, grins overtook their fright when they recognized who it was. MJ had her classic look with lidded eyes and a small smirk. "Sup, losers. Have a fun ride?" "Hey MJ," Peter said. It was alright at the beginning, but then Flash had to go open his mouth. Ned nodded, Yeah, he couldn't even leave us alone on a simple bus ride. He just had to go and pester Peter about his internship here. What an ass. Ned gave a chuckle at that. What did you do on the way here? It must have sucked to be on the bus by yourself. A satisfied smile soon grew on her face at the thought. Oh, I had fun. I just drew some chick who sat across from me. I think she was car sick or something. It was fun to sketch all her different expressions as she went from feeling like crap to actually needing a bag. As usual, the two males never knew how to respond to MJ when she started talking about her suffering-influenced drawings. They just nodded along and let her get lost in thought. The teachers by then had finally fished out their attendance sheets again and begun reading from them to resort everyone again. Peter and Ned moved away from MJ, but not before they were able to say bye to her. She reminded them about how they would meet up for the lunch break, and the two boys gave a thumbs up in acknowledgement. Once Peter and Ned were near Mr. Johnson, they noticed that he had finally corralled his own 15 students. Because of that, their group was one of the first to be able to finally be ushered inside to the front lobby. There were plenty of oohs and ahs from everyone, including Peter, as they stepped past the grand from entrance doors. While Peter frequented the tower quite a bit, it did not mean that he entered the building from the ground floor like everyone else. If he was in costume, he always just webbed into the Avengers common room on the top floors. If he came as Peter, he was always in Tony's company, thus the entrance that they always took was through the billionaire's personal elevator. The man had a bit of an issue with crowds and being standing close to so many people while in a cramped box like an elevator. And so, the personal elevator it was. Peter never complained because he thought it was fun to be able to be in lift that moved so quickly from the ground floor and reach the top floors with no stops in between. Another aspect of taking Tony's personal elevator was how they also secretly arrived at the building via the employee parking garage. That way, if the two of them were spotted, it was at the very least by someone who worked there, meaning that they never tried to stop Tony to ask for an autograph or question who Peter was. Those were the times when Peter occasionally caught glimpses of the front lobby of Stark Industries. As it was, Peter had only been in the front lobby of the building a handful of times because of those circumstances, and so, there were only a few things that seemed familiar. It appeared that there had been some type of renovations recently since the last time the young hero had been here, as a few art displays and water fountains were removed or replaced. Because of all of this, Peter was just as impressed at the sights as his peers were. Flash caught the look on Peter's face and he quickly said something about it. What, never seen the inside of the building you intern at? Oh, Peter stuttered. He did not know how to explain why he never needed to be on the ground floor, but the longer that Peter did not answer, he knew it made him look worse. It seemed that the pause was indeed long enough since Flash spoke up again. Lost for words, Parker? Can't think up a lie quick enough to explain to us your dumb reasons? Ned shifted a bit, wanting to speak up for his friend but not knowing what he could say to get Flash to back off. For the last time, Flash, I am not lying. I do have an internship here, but I don't see why it has to be such a big deal. It felt nice to say that he worked here and have it be true now. I don't brag about it and I don't think I ever really have. In fact, I think that most people at school only know about it because you're the one bragging for me. A few giggles and chuckles floated around after those words. He looked over Flash's shoulder to see that a few of their classmates had been close enough to listen in. Two boys and a girl were laughing at Flash's back and another classmate gave Peter a thumbs up. He felt himself straighten up a bit at the acknowledgement from a few peers. Flash scowled at all of them but wound up stalking away with a bit of red dusting his cheeks. He mumbled something even Peter could not pick up due to the volume in the echo-like space, and he tried to not care. If Flash backed off for hopefully the entire trip, Peter would be able to have fun for once at something school-related. Peter spotted that Flash had walked over to a few other classmates that Peter knew were Flash's friends. Or at least were as close to being friend to someone like Flash. Perhaps the term lackey would be a better definition to use on them. They seemed to cheer Flash up, and at the same time, all four of them turned to stare at Peter. They each gave varying degrees of sneers towards him, and the teen knew that they would try to get payback during the trip somehow. He gave a deep sigh at the thought, and when Ned asked what was wrong, he just tilted his head in Flash's direction. Ned gave a gloomy nod in understanding and put a hand on Peter's shoulder in comfort. Don't worry, dude. Just stick close to Mr. Johnson and hopefully nothing too bad will happen. After that little bit of drama, the group was finally able to make their way to the large reception desk that sat towards the front of the spacious room. Large windows brought in early sunlight, casting bright rays that settled atop the counter and making the white surface seem to shine. Several receptionists were evenly distributed across the large expanse of granite, and Mr. Johnson walked up to the one on the far left. A younger man was tapping away at a computer, and when he noticed the sizable group, he gave a cheery smile. Their teacher introduced who he was and what the group was here for. The kind man behind the counter gave a pleased smile once he learned that they were there for a tour of the place. Even from the back of the group, Peter easily spotted the name Gavin that was printed on the card that hung from his thin neck. "Oh, I am so pleased to see such eager young minds come here to see what there is to learn here. Hold on just a moment please, Mr. Johnson. I will be right back," Gavin said as he walked behind the white wall that proudly stood behind the long counter. A delicate-looking waterfall feature shimmered in the lighting and kept the group's attention while they waited for Gavin. He returned before a minute even passed, holding a small basket that contained a pile of white cards. On the side of the basket was a sheet of paper with "Midtown High School. Mr. Johnson 9 a.m. tour," taped in place. Gavin sat back down in his seat and grabbed a card from the top of the pile. He then placed it underneath a scanner and after a soft beep sounded turned to the group and said, "Kevin Bailey?" A thin classmate of Peter's was startled at his name being addressed, but he quickly got over it and stepped forward with a confused look on his face. Gavin simply handed him the white card that had just been scanned. "It's just a visitor's badge," Gavin said when he noticed the curious looks. "Wear it at all time while here please." He then went back to grabbing a card from the basket and scanning it. One at a time, Gavin would take one, scan it, then simply call out a student's name. While it was only 15 students and one teacher that he was checking in, Peter thought it would still be quicker to at least have someone help. Peter turned to see what the other receptionists were doing, assuming not much, but was surprised to see that the other people behind the large front counter were doing the same thing as the other groups from the school were finally coming inside the building to be checked in as well. Looking at all the other groups being scanned in brought a realization to Peter. He worriedly looked back to Gavin then and kept an eye on the cards as they were scanned in one by one. What if he was outed by FRIDAY? What would the AI even say? Could she even alert people to his secret identity, or would she simply talk about his intern position, if she even talked at all? Yes, Peter wanted to prove Flash wrong, but that did not mean that the young superhero wanted to be recognized by FRIDAY. He just knew that she would let Mr. Stark know that he was here. The longer he worried about it, Peter realized a whole bunch of things could go wrong. Mr. Stark could wind up teasing him in front of his classmates. Or maybe the older man would just say gushy things that would leave him permanently embarrassed for the rest of his short life because he knew that he would just fall and die right there if that happened to him. His thoughts ran wild then as Peter began running different scenarios in his head and began worrying about all the things that the billionaire might do and say if he came down. Peter almost wanted to shout out loud to the AI to ask her to keep quiet. As Gavin's computer continued to randomly scan the students, Peter's worry continued to grow. When he was finally called, he was thankful to hear no remarks from FRIDAY as well as there being no reaction from Gavin. He felt a little bad for thinking in such a way, but Peter thought it made sense seeing as he was someone close to Tony and he did not interact with a lot of people that worked below the penthouse of the building. It made sense that he would not know a lot of the employees that worked on the lower levels of the tower and they would not know him in return. Peter walked up like everyone else and accepted the badge without any complaints. He stepped away to let the next student move forward and he looked down at the badge, curious to see how it looked. It was very simple in design. Printed on one side of the white, vertical card were the words Stark Industries NY at the top, the word visitor boldly displayed in the center, and a barcode at the very bottom of the pass. Everything was printed in black ink. Flipping it to the other side, Peter was impressed to see a faint shimmer on the entire thing, and as he moved the piece of plastic back and forth, he noticed it was a hologram that just said Stark that took up the entire card. The pass was connected to a simple black lanyard that was tied to the card instead of being clipped there with the typical piece of metal. Peter made sure to wear the lanyard right away so that he would not lose it. Wearing the pass, however, made Peter wonder if he had a real badge to get around the building. Then again, He never really thought to leave the common rooms or Tony's lab, so it was not like he really needed to have a pass to get to other floors. It would still be a nice thing to have, Peter thought to himself, as he watched people walk by with their own badges proudly displayed. They swung from their necks and he noticed that the lanyards were various colors. He spotted that they were similar to the visitor badges, with the only discrepancy was that there was a photo of the employee instead of the word visitor in the center of the badge. The longer he looked around at all the badges, Peter decided that he would ask Tony about it. While Flash was distracted by being called up to take his own pass, one of his lackeys took the time to walk up to Peter and Ned with his own ugly smile on his face. "Why you lookin' all confused at the badge, penis? Don't look familiar to ya?" "Oh right. Of course it doesn't, because you don't work here." "Shut up, Sean," Ned said. That was something that Peter was always surprised by. Whenever the two of them were picked on by anyone other than Flash, Ned always seemed to become a bit braver and would stand up for the both of them. Peter never complained because he thought it was awesome to see his best friend put down people like Sean Adler. "What did you just say, Ned?" "I said leave Peter alone. You don't need to be such a dick, you know. And you sure look like an idiot here, trying to look all cool when you don't know anything about this place either. You should watch your mouth, you F." A fake cough stopped Sean from saying another word. Peter looked behind the idiot to see a youthful woman standing right behind him. She had bright red hair in a short bob cut and her arms were firmly crossed as she confidently stood her ground. Peter couldn't help letting a relieved smile fall on his face at her presence. She screamed confidence and looked like a person that would take no funny business from anyone. She also looked vaguely familiar to Peter, though he could not quite place where he might know her from. Sean looked like he finally understood where he was and seemed worried as he realized that anyone could be behind him. He did the classic turn around in slow motion to see who was there. Peter was not disappointed to hear a small squeak escape from Sean at the sight of a rather attractive woman glaring at him. She finally spoke once she had Sean's attention. "Is there a problem here?" "Of course not," Sean practically shouted as he stood there as straight as a pole with his arms pressed to his sides. "Is there going to be a problem?" "And no ma'am, There better not be," she said to Sean specifically before she spared a look to Peter and Ned. Once she gave them a once-over, she turned back the group at large. "Alright you guys, welcome to Stark Industries. My name is Dr. Aaron White and I am going to be your tour guide today, but please, just call me Aaron." She still stood in a somewhat confident pose as she shifted her folded arms to fall and slip onto her hips. She wore a simple pencil skirt, tucked-in blouse, and high heels, but she also wore a crisp lab coat over everything that fell to just below her knees. About half of the group greeted her, though Aaron seemed to not mind the lack of response. That was when Peter realized that while he and Sean had been talking, everyone else had already grabbed their passes and were loosely standing in a circle around Mr. Johnson. After Aaron's announcement, they had turned their attention to her and thus, Peter and Ned, since they were right next to her. He caught sight of Mr. Johnson giving the of them a stern stare before he finally rested his eyes upon Sean. He looked even more frustrated and Peter was happy to assume it was because he had heard the end of Sean's words. While Aaron spoke a bit more about the building and the company, Peter noticed from the corner of his eye Mr. Johnson making his way through the group to get to see him. He patted Sean on the shoulder to gain his attention and pulled the teen away a few steps. He said a few words with a stern look on his face and Sean looked a bit cowed by being lectured by both his teacher and their tour guide. Peter could not stop himself for letting a smug grin reaching his face before he turned to focus back on Aaron. She was still smiling as she looked over the M. "Well, since I see that we all have now got our visitors' badges, let's get going, shall we? After all, the sooner we start this, the more we might be able to get to." The intimidating woman that she had previously been was gone and instead, a passionate young woman took her place. "Before we start though, are there any burning questions that just can't wait to be asked?" Two hands rose and Aaron picked one, letting a girl that Peter had known since middle school, Casey O'Brien, ask the very first her question for the day. "What do you do here, if you don't mind me asking?" "Well, I'm the head of some labs here actually. They're on the higher floors however. Floors 55 to 57 to be exact. I even have a few assistants to help with managing 3 floors, and what we do in our labs are to test the prototypes that come from the higher ups. Personally, I am a level 3 employee here, Erin said as she grabbed her green lanyard from around her neck and showed it to the group. And there are only 186 people here who have the privilege of wearing this color. Even within all those people, I am what you might call one of the bosses for them. I work directly under a yellow badge myself, and when we get the new stuff to play with, I'm one of the people that organizes who gets what for my fellow greens. While she let everyone take in that information, Erin picked the other hand that had been raised. How many people work here? The question was asked by a student by the name of Tred Chavez. Peter did not know much about him since they had only shared 2 other classes all throughout their 4 years of high school, but he was a nice enough guy. There are currently 4,900 people employed in this building and who have an active badge. This does not account for people like Mr. Stark who have their own badge but do not necessarily work here, and for those that are employed by Stark Industries that work in our sister building in Los Angeles. Everyone was amazed by the number, and Peter let his eyes widen in amazement. He had no idea that so many people had a job here and all of them worked under pepper pots. Are there any more questions? Erin asked as she almost turned away, ready to lead the group to the various security lines that lead into the rest of the spacious room. Are you single? Was asked somewhere within the group, though no one could correctly guess who asked it since the person lowered their voice to ask. Erin turned back with a raised eyebrow and a confused smile. The group giggled at the question. Some of them did so because they couldn't believe someone would ask something so personal, while others laughed because it was similar to what they had been thinking. Erin eventually laughed too. It was not an embarrassed laugh though, and it almost appeared as though such a question was asked of her quite often, and she found the humor in hearing something almost regularly. Sorry to say, but I am taken. Married. Actually, so sorry, dear student, wherever you may be, but my heart was stolen long ago, she said as she took her left hand out of her coat pocket to show off her wedding ring. The same student gave a quiet, damn, and another round of laughter spread through them before Erin was finally able to lead them away from the front counter and over to beginning of the security lines. There were plenty of lines that each had a small conveyor belt with an X-ray machine for personal items at the end. Next to each belt was also high-tech metal detector that Peter thought looked cool. A few lines appeared to be priority and were employee only, as Peter did not spot a single person with a black badge walking through them. The majority wore purple, with green being the next most common colored badges, but he spotted the occasional blue, and there even looked to be a single person with a yellow. Erin instead walked them over to what seemed to be the regular security lines for people like Peter and his class. He spotted a lot more people walking through their line with black just like them, but there was still a steady stream of blue passing through here as well. The group eventually fell in line once there was an open spot, and Peter heard a few employees behind them groan at having to now wait for a bunch of teenagers to go through ahead of them. Peter was not sure if Erin heard those words, but either way, she ignored them and turned to address the group as she walked backwards in the line. Like anywhere else that has security like this, please remove any metal that you have on your person and remove shoes as well. Keep the passes on you, however. They do not have metal in them and they are needed to be worn as another layer of security here. She then demonstrated as she went through the detector after placing her high heels and phone in a plastic tub. When she did, the high-tech metal detector did 2 things at once. It made sure that Erin was not concealing anything metallic, but it also scanned the badge that was still being worn. Right away, Peter could faintly hear from the other side of the detector the voice of Friday speaking. He leaned over slightly to get a peek of where the voice could have come from and saw a security guard standing in front of a screen that was attached to the metal detector. He seemed bored as he just stood there, overlooking the consistent list of people making their way through. Erin Elaine White. Laboratory technician, laboratory manager, tour guide, clearance level green, confirmed. It was not glaringly loud, as that would have made the job a mess, having to constantly hear names be spewed out, but for Peter, it was easily heard. Hearing it made him curious to know if he would have anything specific on his name in the database and if it would be spoken out loud too. If there was any information, the young hero really hoped it was nothing too horrible or even something that would give away his other identity. He gave a sigh at those thoughts and simply began taking off his belt, toeing off his shoes, and placing his phone in a plastic tub that was provided for everyone. Peter stood behind Ned, and when it was his friend's turn to walk through, he was able to hear what it should hopefully sound like for Peter too. Edward Patrick Leeds. Field trip visitor. Clearance level black, confirmed. It was then Peter's turn to walk through, and he gave another sigh and just prayed that his information would be normal. He looked up to the expensive-looking metal detector as he walked under it, and Peter easily picked up his own information in Friday's voice. Peter Benjamin Parker. Classified, intern, field trip visitor, clearance level red, confirmed. Now that Peter was on the other side of the machine, he got a full view of the security guard slapping a hand to his mouth to stop himself from spewing out his sip of coffee. He looked back up at the screen to make sure he really just heard what he thought, and once he saw that yes, it was correct, he swiveled his eyes over to Peter. The teen felt a bit uncomfortable being scrutinized by the man and looked away, hoping it would make the security man stop staring. Instead, Peter hurried over to collect his belongings, and then he turned to walk over to where a few classmates who had already went through stood. He saw as he got closer that they and Aaron were looking at him with their own wide eyes of disbelief. "Did I just hear that right?" Aaron asked. "Did Friday just say that you have a red clearance level?" Yeah." Peter did not really know what the color meant, but the more he thought about it, he realized that he had not seen anyone walking around with that color on their badge. He also did not want to say anything that might out him as only being a real intern for the last 3 weeks as opposed to the last 2 years like everyone assumed. Then Erin's surprise left her face, and instead a look of consideration took its place. "Wait, your name is Peter, right? Peter Parker?" Peter just gave a nod. "Yeah," Erin said with a nod. "I've heard your name before. Intern, right?" "That's me." "Okay, at least something is making a little more sense. Though that doesn't explain why you have red." Thinking fast, Peter just said what he thought might make sense while also hoping the words would help to stop any more talk of himself. "Yeah, I have red. But I can't say why though. Classified and all that jazz." He still had no idea just how important being a red level was though. Aaron gave a serious nod of understanding and dropped the subject. It looked like people here knew the importance of being on a need-to-know basis and when to drop things that they were not given permission to know. His peers that had been standing right next to Aaron still had looks of amazement on their faces. Samantha Lee, another person that Peter had known since middle school, spoke up. "I always knew that Flash was such a liar." "Don't worry, Peter. I believe you, and I think it's cool that you have proof to shove in his face now." "Yeah, if Flash even heard that is," Peter mumbled to himself as he looked behind him to see where the bully was. Ned walked up to him then and put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about it, Peter. He doesn't need to hear it, and besides, I'm sure something else will come up so that you can prove it to him." "Yeah, like I want something else to pop up like this." "Come on, Peter, it can be fun like I said. I really just want to rub it in Flash's face that you're working here and doing really cool things." "Well, I'm happy you think what I do is cool, of course. But, what's up with that red business? Why are you stuck with black like us losers when you could be wearing a more fun color?" "Dunno," was all Peter said with a shrug, "and honestly, I don't care that much. It's cool to know that I have a real pass like the other workers else here, but right now I'm not all that worried about it." "Yeah, I get what you mean. But you better figure it out soon and then show me what it looks like someday." "Yeah, I will. Ned, I tell and show you everything, don't worry too much about it." The grin Ned gave Peter then was completely heartwarming, and it made Peter feel so lucky to have someone like Ned as his best friend. Once the rest of the group and Mr. Johnson came through, with no indication that they had heard about the red badge, Aaron then headed off to the left and up to a pair of long escalators. There was no more talk about the interesting information on Peter's pass, and everyone was happy to follow Aaron so that they could finally get the tour started. "Why don't we start at the first floor?" Aaron began as she stepped onto the moving stairs first and turned around to watch them follow. "That way we can get some of the basics out of the way." Mr. Johnson made sure he was the last one to step onto the platform so that the group of students were corralled and accounted for. As Peter and Ned stood on their own step somewhere in the middle of the group, they looked down at the ground floor where they had just come from and were amazed at the different angle they were getting. All the workers that were walking by and heading in all different directions was fun to watch. The friends looked up then and enjoyed the view of the New York streets that the tall windows framed. The ground floor of SI and the first floor were technically in the same room. It was a very large space with elongated walls and an open floor plan. The first floor only took up one half of the ground floor, letting a long glass half wall be the barrier that kept the areas separated. The entire place was white and seemed to glow with all the lights that filled the place, yet It was not blinding or an uncomfortable feeling. Rather, it simply made the place feel clean and orderly. The ride up the escalator seemed a bit longer than a normal one, but when they were finally let off, Peter and his class were greeted to the sight of another large, open-floored room that held a lot of Avengers memorabilia and prototypes of various things that were built by the Starks. There was a small stand that had held a plaque that stood in the middle of the room, and that was where Erin headed with the group following like ducklings. "Okay," she said as she tapped the plaque with a single finger. "This is where a lot of common things are displayed for people to look at them. There are plenty of things exhibited here, but I will say now that most are replicas. Still, that doesn't take away from how cool some of this stuff is. Everything has at least a paragraph of information on it nearby the object, so go ahead and look around. I think 10 minutes is a good amount of time to hang around here, don't you think? And don't forget, if you have any questions, come find me and I will be happy to answer anything you want to know." With some nods, Erin then let them go and do their own thing with the warning that they were to not leave the floor. Peter and Ned made a beeline for the Stark inventions, knowing that most of the others would prefer the hero items on the other side. They were right, and the two had plenty of space around them to ogle the replicas of inventions that Tony and Howard Stark had made throughout their lives. Ned made sure that he read every word on each plaque, and the two eventually made their way to a corner where a 2-minute short video was on loop, giving a brief explanation on who the father and son were and what they had achieved through their inventions. A man with broad shoulders was already there, sitting on the single bench that was provided. He was wearing a simple outfit of blue jeans, a pale blue t-shirt, and a brown baseball cap. He could only see the back of the man, but right away, Peter felt as though he knew the person. Not wanting to try his luck and making it awkward if he got it wrong, Peter and Ned simply sat on the other side of the long, cushioned bench and watched the clip. After it looped one more time, the three wound up standing to leave at the same time, and that was when Peter caught the side of the man's face and took a step back in surprise. "Mr. Rogers? What are you doing here?" Steve Rogers' shoulders hunched at the words, and he slowly turned towards the two friends with a worried look on his face. Right away, the worry turned to surprise once he got a proper look at the two teens. "Peter, what are you doing here? Don't you have school?" "Hey, I asked you first. But I am in school technically. I'm on a field trip right now," Peter explained with air of calm around him. At his side, Ned was frantically whispering to himself, "Oh my God, it's Captain America. Oh my God, oh my God. Peter, how'd I look? Peter, why aren't you introducing your best friend?" Steve had clearly heard Ned's mutterings and gave him a nod and a simple, "hello," with his famous smile before he turned back to Peter. "I'm touring too, I guess." "Huh?" The captain gave a sheepish shrug of his shoulders then, "Yeah. Sometimes when I want to be alone but not be too far away, I just come down here to the levels with all the museums and memorabilia. I find it kind of fun and even a little bit comforting." "Yeah, well I bet it's not all that relaxing since you're wearing a disguise. You clearly don't want to be recognized, and I don't know if you can even call it that, a disguise. So lame." Peter had made a sweeping motion with his hands towards the older man as though that was enough for Peter to get his point across. "Hey, I'll have you know that I have worn this disguise more than once already, and no one has ever realized who I was." "Oh really? I find that hard to believe." There was a pause as the two looked at each other. Ned was still fidgeting in amazement, and Steve had a look on his face as though he did not want to say something. He then sighed and nodded his head. "Yeah, okay. Maybe there was the occasional kid who figured it out, and I guess you're now included in that, so maybe you should find something better to wear, or better yet, don't try to sneak into a place that literally has your face framed in some places." Steve started laughing aloud. Ned was too struck to laugh along with Steve freaking Rogers, but gave a small smile when he noticed how comfortable and casual Peter was acting in front of such a hero. "Oh my God, is that Captain America?" Peter and Steve stopped laughing right away and looked at each other. For Peter, he felt bad, thinking that it was his fault for talking to the man and making him stand out a little more rather than being a regular person in the background. "Oh," Ned muttered as he looked between the other two and saw Samantha looking at the hero in awe. Behind her were a few other classmates, and as the other classmates turned to her at her words then followed where she was looking, everyone soon wore similar expressions of shock and wonder at seeing Captain America just standing there in a t-shirt and jeans. "Ah, geez," Steve said with a slump of his shoulders. He gave a sigh as he looked to Peter and said, "Sorry bud, looks like my cover's blown," and took off his hat so that everyone could see that it was in fact Steve Rogers standing there in the flesh. "What are you apologizing to me for?" Peter asked quietly before his peers could rush over and hear their conversation. "Well, I know how you get when it comes to acting familiar with us when you're trying to be just regular Peter Parker. So, I was just saying sorry for cutting our chat quick and that I was about to pretend like I don't know you." "Oh, right." Peter looked down slightly at those words. It was true. Peter did usually pretend that he did not know the Avengers if he was even near them when not in the suit. It made him sad to realize that he did that quite a bit too. It sounded wrong when Steve said it out loud like that, and Peter suddenly felt the need to shout out loud that Steve Rogers was practically an uncle to him. He shoved that feeling deep down, however, when time ran out and Samantha and the rest of the group suddenly huddled around the super soldier and started hammering him with questions. Peter backed away with Ned at his side, and the two shifted around so that they were at the back of the group but could still listen in to whatever was going to happen now that the whole class knew that there was an Avenger in their midst. When Peter finally moved away so that he would not be swarmed like what was currently happening to Steve, he made sure to securely grab Ned's arm so that he was not circled as well. The heavier teen gave a breathy thanks to his best friend and watched stunned at how his classmates were behaving. The two teens easily found themselves towards the back of the group and watched as the four people in front of Steve continued to grow until 13 eager teenagers and one teacher were standing before the first Avenger. Steve, all the while, had the classic smile gracing his handsome face and nodded to everyone in greeting when he made eye contact. Peter was almost 80% sure that the smile was completely fake, though of course the man was too nice to say or do anything. "Dang, Peter, was I ever like that before I knew?" Ned asked with a hint of a disturbed look on his face. "Knew what?" "Knew that you went on the web." Peter looked at Ned with a raised eyebrow before he turned back to gaze at the spectacle before them. "Oh, you mean if you were ever completely bonkers when it came to seeing a superhero standing there, right before your eyes?" Ned gave a short nod with a slightly opened mouth. "No," Peter said with a short laugh, "you never acted like that. You were more of the, still as a statue, kind of excited and still kind of are. But you were still pretty funny to watch when you would tell me all about how cool you thought Spider-Man was." Ned quickly turned to Peter with a blush making its way up from his neck. "Hey, I thought you said we wouldn't talk about that anymore. I didn't know." "Yeah, you're right. Sorry." The laugh and smile on Peter's face said how sorry he really felt, however. Ned soon found himself laughing too. The two turned back in time to watch Mr. Johnson go from a fan to a worried teacher. It seemed that he finally noticed that his students were not giving Steve any breathing room. A reddish tint began forming on his face, either from exertion with trying to push the kids back or from mortification. Peter did not know. He felt a little sorry that he was not rushing in to help, but what could he do? He was weak Peter Parker that everyone knew almost failed gym every year. Peter was then truly considering helping, but before he could, someone else finally spoke. "Hey." It was Erin, and she looked angry. "What do you guys think you're doing ganging up someone like that? It doesn't matter who they are. Give them a little bit of personal space, please. And how about respect while you're at it to your guest, your teacher, and your school for representing them with such poor taste?" Everyone else had eyes widened in surprise, Steve included. It was almost as though it was choreographed when all the students and Mr. Johnson took one big step backwards, and suddenly there was a weird circle of empty space between them and the hero. With a weak chuckle at the awkward turn, the super soldier just raised a hand to rub at the back of his head as he looked at Erin, then the tour group, then back to Erin. "Thanks for listening to her, you guys. Don't want to anger the workers here. But now that you've caught me, I don't really mind answering a few things like an impromptu interview. That okay?" Peter was pretty sure that he had asked that to Erin since that was where he was looking, but everyone else nodded too. By this point, their tour guide had gone back to her intimidating pose with folded arms and a strong stance. Erin then gave a sigh and looked down at her watch, biting her lip. "I suppose, as long as you guys are okay with this taking up some time from somewhere else." The eager nods were all she needed before she rolled her eyes and made a sweeping motion with her arms to Steve. "Floor's all yours. For no longer than 15 minutes. She had to shout the last few words to get her point across as the flood of questions came pouring out once the students realized they were staying. "Mr. Captain America, sir, how do you like living in the 21st century?" What's your favorite color? Have you ever heard of the Beatles? Please say, Alexa, play Despacito. It's for scientific reasons. How much can you bench press? Can I get a selfie? Oh, me too. Selfie please. Peter was amazed. His classmates were so eager and loud. It was amazing that there were only 13 people talking over themselves. And all the while, Steve Rogers, the Captain America, just smiled and nodded and answered everything like it was as easy as pie. The 21st century is very interesting so far. I've learned a lot, though I am sure that I have a lot more to learn. Can never have too much knowledge, you know. I just know that you folks will laugh at me for saying my favorite colors are red, white, and blue. So how about I just say that I enjoy a nice pale shade of sky blue? Yes, I have heard of the Beatles. Tony has made sure that I have listened to every song made by them at least once. Alexa, play Despacito? Did I say that right? Right now, I think I can bench. Oh, maybe 650 pounds. Yeah, that sounds about right. And of course you can get a picture. He leaned down next to Samantha first and gave a small smile as she pushed her phone away so that she could capture herself standing next to the muscular man. She gave a squeal in thanks and moved aside as her friend took her place, phone at the ready. It seemed that after his acceptance to take a selfie with Samantha, everyone else just lined up, happy to get one themselves and seemingly done with asking questions. When it seemed like the students had calmed down and had their fun, Mr. Johnson got his turn to jump in and happily said, "Mr. Rogers, I have been a huge fan ever since I was a little boy. I was born 10 years after you were frozen, so I never got to hear anything in real time, but you were simply a hero that I never stopped hearing about. I'm sure you hear this a lot, but knowing I have this chance to say this to you, knowing I might never get the chance again, I had to say something, if that's all right with you?" "Go right ahead," Steve said with another patient smile. "I just want to tell you how thankful I am for what you did for this country and that my late uncle survived the war because of you. He never said anything about talking to you, but he said that your team helped his out one time and that you might have used your shield to shoot a grenade off course that had been heading for him. I've heard that same story over and over as I grew up, but I never got tired of it. I waited almost as long as the rest of the world had, hoping for the day that you would be found after your ship went down. And now, here we are. Again, all I can say is thank you." From where he was standing, Peter could see a bit of a shine to his eyes as he said his piece. Mr. Johnson moved to shake Steve's hand then, and knowing how much words like what his teacher had just said meant to Steve, Peter knew what was going to happen before anyone else. Steve eagerly accepted the handshake and then used the same arm to drag the teacher into a light hug. Again, with heightened hearing on his side, Peter was the only one to hear Steve tell Mr. Johnson, "Thank you for telling me a bit of your story, and I am always grateful to hear from the families that I helped. I may have never met your uncle, but now all these years later, I get to thank him through you, and that is all I need." The two moved back then, and when Mr. Johnson moved aside, he was able to use a sleeve to wipe his face without anyone except Steve seeing. After that, it seemed like Aaron was eager to take their little group back on track. Peter had a different idea, however. He did not know what came over him then, but Peter just wanted to say something to Steve to shake up the group a bit before they moved on. He was not so sure why, but there was a nagging in the back of his mind saying that this was because he felt a little down after realizing that he always tried to play off Steve and the other Avengers when he was just Peter Parker. Now was the chance to right that wrong and say his peers to know that he was somewhat close to the captain. Nothing came to mind as he let himself walk a bit closer to his uncle in all but blood, and knowing that everyone was now looking at them, he said, "So Captain America, Steve Rogers." "That's me." Steve gave an easy smile, though Peter could just tell that he was curious and perhaps a bit wary of what Peter might say. "If you had to pick your favorite hero," Peter kept going with a sly look growing on his face as he slowly came up with his idea, "between Iron Man and Spider-Man, who would you choose?" The confident look on Steve's face vanished like a light switch. While Peter's peers thought the change was because he was such a noble man that he could not have a favorite, Peter knew the truth. Steve could never answer that without consequences for two reasons. The first and most obvious was because Peter was right before him. It was true that Steve could simply say Spider-Man to make Peter happy, but the second reason that Steve would struggle with the question was because the teen also knew that Steve was not a good liar. Whatever he said now, Peter would know truth from lie, and Steve knew that as well. Of course he going to say Iron Man, Parker, Flash interrupted as he got slightly close to the two. He knew better than to get too close after Aaron's rather stern speech, but he seemed like he still wanted to have the last word. Or at least, Flash wanted to sound smarter than Peter while in front of a hero like Captain America. "Oh, great," Peter muttered quietly to himself as he looked down so that he did not have to meet the other's gaze. Apparently, he was not as quiet with his words as he thought he had been when he noticed Steve flash his eyes over to him before he turned back to Flash with a light frown overtaking his expression. "Oh, and why is that, mister?" Steve asked in his usually friendly tone, but he ended up folding his arms, making them look just a bit larger than normal. He stood to his full height as he towered over the teen and stared Flash down. "Flash," the other teen said in introduction with a smile and a twitch of his arm as though wanting to raise it for a handshake but stopped. Peter hid a grin at that, knowing that the other teen was probably too nervous. "Flash," Peter knew that Steve asked that with the intention of sounding like he was confirming what he heard. But what came out, however, was a tone that bordered on uncertainty and a bit of confusion at hearing it. There were a few snickers behind Peter and Flash then, since everyone knew how much he hated his real name. Flash gave an uncomfortable cough. I'm Eugene." The friendly smile came back. "Oh, well then, nice to meet you, Eugene. But what did you mean with what you said just now? How do you know that I should answer with Iron Man?" "Well, I thought it would be a bit obvious. You have known him longer." A smug smile graced his face then, as though knowing that was the end of the argument. "That might be true, but we did have a falling out a couple years back. You, of course, know about that, I'm sure?" It was true that there had been a bit of a breakup in the team back when Peter first met Steve on that airport terminal, but everyone had come a long way since then. The two leaders had finally put aside their differences and the Avengers finally came together stronger than ever. Peter was simply shocked that Steve brought it up because the young hero felt as though he had a pretty clear picture that the super solider preferred to not bring up that time in his life because of how much heartbreak it had caused for everyone involved. "Of course I know," Flash said, "but I think that it still stands that you'd be closer to Tony Stark than some wannabe hero." The face Steve gave at those words was priceless. Peter actually had to turn away and pretend to cough to stop the snort of laughter from escaping his nose. Flash heard anyways and gave him an ugly look, and Ned, who had still been standing near Peter and Steve, just hid behind a hand to stop his own smile. When he turned back, Peter saw that Steve's face was still showing off the mix of confusion, anger, and something else that Peter did not recognize. "I like to think that Spider-Man is an actual hero just like the rest of us. He saves people just Tony and I do. He's definitely no wannabe. In fact, I think that he does more hero work than Tony and I do combined. Tony has other things in his life that he has to take care of sometimes, and as for myself, well, I guess I'm just not out there on the streets as much the Spider is and ready to swing 2 blocks over to stop every thief along the way." The warm feeling that flooded Peter then was something he would never forget. He hunched his shoulders in a bit of shyness and lowered his head to hide his blush and large grin from Steve. He felt giddy at the compliment and even felt a bubble of laughter trying to escape. When there was a silence that fell over the group, Peter looked up to see that everyone was looking at Steve in wonder. He was not glaring at Flash, but the neutral look might as well have been. Flash opened and closed his mouth a few times, not knowing what to say to that. He reminded Peter of a fish. Before the awkward silence was interrupted by Erin. She held a look that spoke of how uncomfortable she felt as well, but as a professional, she knew when to deal with it and try to move forward. And that was what she did when she told them that the 15 minutes were up and that they needed to head to the next part of the tour. That seemed to wake everyone up, and Peter's class started heading back to Erin, where she stood in a small hallway off to the side of the hero exhibit. A few braver students turned back to say goodbye to Steve, and he gave wave in reply. Flash grumbled to himself, and as he headed over as well, he spared another glare to Peter. The teen hero moved to follow after his group but was stopped by a warm hand on his shoulder. He turned to follow the appendage and found Steve's concerned face on the other end. "You alright?" Peter looked back to see that everyone else was loitering around Erin. Some were on their phones, but a few of them were watching what was going on. Peter felt another odd feeling in his stomach when he turned back to face his uncle in all but blood, not knowing what to do. "Yeah," he finally said. "I should probably head over there," he said with a tilt of his head in the group's direction. "Tour's still going on, ya know." The older hero pursed his lips at those words. He looked over Peter's head to his classmates before he looked back down at Peter and lowered himself to be closer in height. I didn't like that kid much, you know him? Who, Flash? Yeah, he's a bit of a… Peter did not finish that line of thought knowing just who was standing before him. Instead, he gave a look to Steve that summed up what the end of that sentence would have been. Steve gave an unimpressed look with a raised eyebrow, but his twitch of a smile gave away how much he agreed with what went unsaid. Yeah, I can kinda see what you mean, and I've only known for a few minutes. Well, I should really get going. What you doing later? Will I see you? Yeah, you'll see me later, Pete. I might hang around here more now that it's quiet again. But I'll be up there this evening. Cool, Peter said as he started walking backwards toward his tour group before he turned around to walk normally. He paused for just a moment, yet in that time, a million different things were running through his mind. He finally took a breath and turned back to Steve once more. Without thinking too much about it, Peter headed over and eagerly wrapped his arms around the other man. Steve had given a surprised oof at the impact, but almost instinctively wrapped his arms around Peter's shoulders in response to the unexpected embrace. A smile easily grew upon his face as he looked down at Peter's curly head of hair. What's with the hug, Pete? Peter said nothing and instead smushed his face into the chest in front of EAD. He let himself take in a breath and caught the scent of familiar laundry detergent, and his shoulders lost all tension. When he pulled back, he did not realize that he had a completely sincere smile in place but for Steve. His eyes widened in amazement at the look the kid was giving him. It held nothing but trust and admiration. Okay, I really gotta go now, but I just really wanted to do that and I'm glad I did. See ya, Steve. Peter finally moved away that time for sure and gave a wave over his shoulder as he headed for Ned. Well, now that we're all gathered again, let's go to the next location, Erin said with a smile to the group as though hoping it would distract them from what had just obviously been a tender moment for one of her tourists. She walked them further down the small hallway away from the gallery where they had just been, and once they reached the other end, they were greeted to a decently sized room that held a few rows of elevator doors. Plenty of workers were flittering about as they waited around for lifts to arrive. Some were walking off the opened ones with hurried steps, and there seemed to be an overall feeling of productivity as people quickly worked their way around one another to get to their destinations. Again, Erin waved them over to the end of the line of elevators where not a lot of people were standing around. These are the employee and freighter elevators. They can carry people as well as a lot of supplies or weight at one time and are pretty large. They need to be because there's a lot of people that work here, and these things need to be able to carry a lot at one time to get them all to where they need to be. The other reason these guys are so big is because there are plenty of heavy loads need to be able to easily go from floor to floor. A hand must have been raised because Erin pointed a finger over Peter's shoulder and a voice spoke up. He turned to see that it was Jason Wolf, a fellow nerd like Ned and Peter who loved to talk about Lego stuff with the two friends sometimes. Where are we headed? We are going a few floors up from here, to level 27, to see another exhibit. That one holds a lot of the more technological things that I am sure you guys will like seeing as you guys are engineering students. But don't worry, I won't just be taking you guys to museums the whole time. I'll show you guys my lab and some other cool things that not a lot of people get to see on their tours. There was an excited murmur at those last words, and Erin looked a little smug as she preened under their odd looks. So can I ask about the badges here? I've seen the different colors that people are wearing and have been wondering for a while now, Jason then said. Oh, Erin gave a look of surprise. I guess I never said anything about that, huh? Sorry you guys. I guess it just slipped my mind. Of course I can tell you. Finally, something that Peter was curious about. He hoped he did not look as interested as everyone else, but he just could not help himself with wondering what the differing colors meant and where his apparent red clearance level fit into the whole thing. Well, Erin began, if you remember, I said that there is a total of 4,900 people that work here. Broken down, these people are put into one of 5 levels of security and given a clearance level. Of that big number I just gave you, 4,032 of them are level 1 and wear a blue badge. Really? But that's practically everyone here, Casey said with wide eyes. You're right, but when you think about it, it would make sense for less people to be at a higher level, Erin said. Next, at level 2, there are a total of 672 workers that wear a purple badge. As you know, I am part of the 168 that wear green, which at level 3. And right above me is level 4, which are the yellows. There are only 28 people in the entire building who have the privilege of wearing that color. Though you might hear some people call them the golds instead. Personally, I don't care and wind up saying the two things interchangeably, but you gotta admit, gold sounds cooler. What about level 5? Kevin asked. He was one of the students that had not been there to hear Friday say Peter's level and did not know that what he just said made a few of the group pause to sneak a look at Peter. It was obvious when put together that Aaron had talked about 4 out of the 5 levels and red had not been spoken about yet. The easiest conclusion was that what they were about to hear would be what they were expecting, Peter to be placed at the top of security priority. Aaron spoke then before any more thoughts could run rampant through their minds. That's right. Level 5. Even she spared a look to Peter, but everyone but him missed the look as it was so brief. That would be red and only 8 people here have that. Also, if you did your math, you would realize that some of those people are not employed here. Remember when I talked about Tony Stark having a pass too, though he does not technically work here? He's on this level. Eyes grew as large as saucers at that. Now, those that had known about the metal detector debacle were not trying to be subtle in looking at Peter with the new knowledge shining in their eyes. The other half of the group was confused, and Peter was not about to say anything to fill them in. He was fine dying of embarrassment right then. Thank you very much. Just let some hot air melt him into a small puddle and let him fall into some random grate, never to see daylight ever again. Shani Kanan, one of the more level-headed girls who loved learning, and would prefer to ignore gossip such as what Peter really did in the building as a level red, asked a question to shift the attention back to the tour. What do these people that have these colors do then? Surely you don't mean to say that there are 28 yellows and all they do is science and lab work. What about janitorial workers, security guards, maintenance crews? The pleased look that Aaron gave Shani at those questions spoke of how many people did not usually ask such a thing. Very excellent question, and you're right. Those 28 people are not all workers that get to do lab stuff all day. Those 28 are divided into 4 sections. 2 of them are custodians, 2 are security guards, and 3 are maintenance. The rest are divided into the business side with 10 people and the science with 11. Those numbers fluctuate as you go back down in level, and as you can imagine, the number gets bigger too since there are more people to fill those different roles. At the bottom where most people work is where we also branch out a lot. There are a whole bunch of divisions which I will not bore you with. Just know that the higher up you go, the more responsibilities we have. When it looked like no one else had any questions, the redhead then turned around and swiped her green badge over a keypad that was next to a set of elevator doors. Aaron seemed a bit surprised to see that it was taking a few moments for the door to open. It's probably being used by someone from my floor. Sure enough, a few moments later, the doors slipped open and the students were greeted to the sight of a single man in the elevator, holding a clipboard and leaning against a large object that was covered by a white cloth and took up half of the elevator's space. "Oh hey, Aaron," the man said as he looked up from his clipboard to Aaron, then looked behind her at the group of kids. "Guess you're on a tour then." "Sure am," Aaron said as she greeted the man with a nod. She turned back to her group as she swept an arm out and gestured to the man. "Everyone, this is Cato Fisher. He works directly under me, and as you can see, he is also a green badge holder." Cato gave a casual wave of his hand as the group waved back while a few of them tried to get a peek at what was under the cloth. Aaron then seemed to realize that the object did indeed take up a lot of space within the lift. She seemed to be having an inner debate as Peter watched her give a small frown and bite her lip briefly. "Helping me out with these guys?" "Sure thing. Whatcha need, boss?" "Can you let half of these guys get in with you? And let them off at floor 27 before you head on up?" Cato had a look on his face that spoke of how much he wanted to do that, but eventually gave a sigh and a nod. Aaron gave a thanks and then split the group apart with 6 students and Mr. Johnson getting into the elevator. The door closed after the rest got a peek of Cato leaning down for his badge to be read by a scanner on the inside of the lift. Once that was taken care of, Aaron simply walked over to the next available elevator and did the same scan with her green pass. A soft ding told them when the elevator was there, and this time, the space was empty of anyone or anything. She happily gestured for them to step in before she did. As the door closed, Peter widened his eyes when he finally realized that back in the other room, Steve had never answered his question about his favorite hero. He scrunched his nose in both frustration and humor at being swept up in the moment and forgetting that he had asked the older man a question in the first place. Peter started planning out ideas on what he could do to get back at the older man later. Erin quickly leaned down like Kato had and let the scanner on the inside of the lift read her badge. Friday spoke the same words she had said at the metal detector and then asked for a floor to be stated. Erin replied with 27 and everyone felt the familiar push of gravity upon their shoulders as they headed up. So what floor numbers do the different badges get access to? Kevin asked as he looked up at a screen at the top of the lift that continuously flashed different numbers as they kept rising. Well, there are 82 floors here at Stark Tower and of those, almost everyone is able to be on about half of those floors. Blue gets access to the ground floor all the way up to 35. Purple is 45 while I get up to 55. The golds go all the way to 65 while the 8 reds have all the way up to 82. Though honestly, the actual floors that hold the business and sciences of this company are on floor 65 or below that to make sure most people here don't have to worry about clearance. It's only the super important things that are on higher floors. Well then what is on floors 66 to 82 then? Only 8 people get to be on all those floors? Erin seemed to frown then as she stared at the shiny elevator doors. Honestly, I don't know too much about what goes on up there. Never actually been up there myself. The 9 students fell silent at those words and it soon filled the space. Peter felt someone shifting around him and saw from his peripheral that Samantha was sneaking looks at him. He gave a small frown in confusion and waited to see if she would say what was clearly on her mind. "Hey, Peter?" she finally asked when she looked up and met his gaze. "Yeah? I just wanted to say sorry for back there." Now Peter's confused frown was even deeper. Sorry for what? Samantha looked down for a moment and there seemed to be a bit of pink on her cheekbones. "I didn't know it at the time, but before we left there, I saw you give Captain America a hug. He looked real happy about it so I thought that you two were close somehow. So, I just wanted to say sorry for how I shouted his name earlier when it looked like he was trying to stay hidden and talk to just you and Ned." "Oh," was all Peter was able to let escape from himself as he watched the others turn to listen in since they had obviously heard everything. He then gave what he hoped was a casual shrug. "It's all right." His horrible excuse of a disguise was bound to make him found out sooner or later. There were a few unsure chuckles then, but it seemed like Samantha's words had been all they needed to start speaking up themselves. "So do you know the other Avengers?" Kevin asked. "A little bit, but honestly, I'm just around Mr. Stark most of the time. Though I have met Pepper Potts a handful of times and obviously Mr. Rogers." "So you were an intern? I always knew that Flash was such a liar," Samantha chimed in again as she leaned a bit into Peter's space. Her friend, Casey, nodded and softly said, "That's so cool, Peter. So, what do you do then as a red badge intern?" Oh, he stuttered, not knowing what to say. But then he thought about what Mr. Stark had said 3 weeks ago when Peter had finally let the cat out of the bag. The older man had said that the work that Peter had already been doing before he had officially became an intern, was what he would be doing now, just with a job title as a bonus. Knowing now that it would be easier, Peter confidently said, "Well, I help Mr. Stark out sometimes with little things. He lets me tinker with his line of latest phones and tablets, lets me work on a few of my own ideas, and just other little things. I even got to help with taking care of his Iron Man suits once." Most of them had wide eyes at that last thing and Peter quickly said something before their thoughts could run wild, and by that, I mean that I only got to touch one once and clean it. I didn't actually work on any of them. "Still," Kevin said with a grin as he patted Peter on the shoulder, "you got to touch a freaking Iron Man suit that has been worn by Tony Stark. So cool, man." "So, how did you get the gig?" Erin finally said since she had also easily heard what was being said in such a small space. "Oh, I just made a great first impression I guess. You do know that only college students are able to apply for the internship program here, right kid?" Yeah I do, but like I said, I honestly just happened to be at the right place at the right time. I bet that if someone else had been where I had been, they would be standing here instead." Erin gave a hesitant nod as she thought to herself before speaking up, "Well, regardless, I think it's pretty cool too. You seem like you got a good head on your shoulders there and if Mr. Stark likes you enough to hire you so young, Who am I to judge? It felt nice to recognized by someone who Peter could consider a type of coworker. He smiled at her and thanks, and she easily smiled back. By the way, you guys, she said as she turned away from Peter to address everyone instead. Is Flash that kid who thought he knew who Captain Rogers would choose between Iron Man and Spider-Man? Almost at once, they all said yes. Erin turned back to the front then as the elevator finally reached its destination. She gave a simple, as a small frown grew between her brows again. She then stepped off the lift and onto the floor once she made sure that everyone else had gotten off before her and herded them into another group as they waited for the other half of the group to arrive. As Peter and his classmates stepped onto floor 27 and into another long hallway, he turned back to see Erin suddenly wrapped up in her phone. She almost let the sliding doors close on her and she gave a small squeak of surprise at almost being squished. Instead, at the slightest touch of her hand in her instinct to stop them from getting her, the doors slid back open at the lightest touch of her hand. A small chuckle escaped Peter at the sight, and he could hear a few quiet snickers around him too at seeing the redhead look a bit flustered for the first time since they had met her. She turned to glare at them, but Peter saw her own lips curl into a smile as she turned away from them to look back at her phone. Her attention was still on the device, but her clear voice rang out as she waved her arm over to herself. Come over here you guys so you're not blocking the way. Just give me a few minutes to do something real quick, please. Her nails regularly tapped across the touchscreen of her phone as she moved at a speed even Peter was impressed with, and he was a teenager who was always on his phone. His curiosity grew a little then, wondering who she was speaking to, but he soon lost interest, thinking it was probably for work or a friend. Taking the time to look around, though not seeing much since they were still in the small hallway where the elevators were located, Peter noticed that the other half of his class was not there yet. They might have been stopped a few times on the way up. Plenty of people were beginning to fill up the room they were in, both leaving and arriving through the lifts. It was like organized chaos seeing everyone easily move around one another, and Peter thought it was fascinating to watch. Ned nudged Peter then, and when he looked over, the other teen said, "They all kind of look like Legos, huh? With their blocky suits and briefcases." A laugh escaped Peter and he nodded. "Yeah, you're right, now I kind of want to build this place." "Hey, you think there is an actual box set of Stark Tower?" "Dude, I bet there totally is. How come we never thought of that before?" "Beats me. But if there isn't, let's just make one ourselves. Bet we could make it better on our own anyways." "True, and we can add things to improve the real thing." Peter did not know it then, but the other half of their tour group had finally arrived, and just behind him, Flash stood there and had heard their conversation. "Legos?" Peter jumped at hearing Flash's voice just behind him. It was a reaction that he had for a few reasons. The first being because he did not hear him arrive since they were standing in a loud area and thus his hearing had been useless. The other reason was because Peter would never allow someone like Flash Thompson to be at his back where he was vulnerable. There were simply too many reasons why that was a bad thing. When he finally turned to face the other, the young hero spotted the sneer that raised one side of Flash's nose. "What are you guys, 9? Who the hell plays with those kid toys when they're in high school?" "Hey, it's not like we're asking others to build them," Peter said with a weak shrug. "Well, it's stupid. I can't believe you guys are almost adults." Flash gave an exaggerated eye roll at his own words as he crossed his arms over a puffed out chest. "Hey, Pete just said that it's our own lives. We can do whatever the hell we want. Why do you care what we do? And besides, Legos are cool." Peter silently nodded in agreement. "I don't care what you girls do together in behind closed doors." The two friends rolled with eyes this time at the double meaning. "But I don't want to have to listen to you two get all weird when you try to brag about making something with thousands of dumb plastic bricks." Peter and Ned kept quiet then, not knowing what else they could say to get Flash to stop talking to them. Erin's tapping seemed to pick up then, though Peter was sure it was his imagination just trying to fill the space with something else that was not Flash's ugly face. Ned and Peter refused to say anything else to Flash, and so the three of them wound up standing there, glaring at one another as the silence continued for a few more seconds. Erin finally put her phone away after she noticed that everyone had gathered together once again. "Alight you guys, welcome to floor 27. In the grand scheme of things, we are not that high up into the tower, but there are some fun things that are around this floor. So why don't you follow me this way, please, and we can see some interesting stuff." Erin made another gestural wave with her arm as she turned to head down the hall and into the rest of the floor. Once they stepped out and into the museum, Peter saw it was another grand space that made it seem like they were on the ground floor all over again. The entire room was another large space that was tiled with eye-catching designs and filled with bright, warm lights. Everything seemed to echo and go on forever. Stylish windows were on every wall, letting people see the view of New York from each direction. Above them, there was a large rectangular cutout that led right into the upper floors. Again, a glass half-wall was the safety rail for the onlookers up above, and as their tour group walked further in, Peter felt his head progressively tilt further back as he noticed that the hole went up to at least a few floors. Objects peeked out from over the glass railing from the higher floors, and though it was not much, Peter could easily guess that there were more things to look at in the museum. It told Peter that this place had 5 entire floors dedicated to it. So cool. Plenty of people were walking through the place, wearing all different colored lanyards. For the most part, they were black and blue, but other colors did pop in occasionally. The volume was a sort of droning noise, but it was surprisingly not difficult to hear someone that stood nearby. Looking up again, Peter tried to get a look at what might be on the other floors when he spotted a head hanging over the glass rail. They pulled back to hide when Peter got just the barest hint of a glance at them, though he could still spot a pair of hands that were gripping the railing. He blinked in shock, and when he opened them not even half a second later, the figure was completely gone and Peter was left wondering if there had even been anyone there to begin with. Peter shook his head to get rid of the thought and instead let a bright smile grow alongside his excitement and anticipation at what he might see and hear. Ned touched his shoulder with his own and they traded giddy look. They wanted to run off right away, but Erin's voice stopped that train of thought. "Welcome to Trinkets Hall." She made small jazz hands at her own words. "Before you ask, yes, I know that it is a bit of an odd title, and yes, Mr. Stark named it himself." She looked as eager as everyone else as she watched them continue to look around in awe. "Once again, be mindful of not touching anything and just being careful. You can go up to the 28th floor using the escalators over on the east side of the room. Don't bother trying to go up to the higher floors. There are no escalators to take you and you need workers' pass to even get up there. We will go there together after looking around down here. I'm going to be walking around too, so if you want to listen in on what I can add to some of the displays, stick around. One last thing. Since there are 2 floors to explore, I'm thinking that half an hour is a good enough time to see everything to your little heart desire. At 11:15, please make your way back here to the elevators. Otherwise, have fun," she said before she stepped aside and let them explore on their own. Peter and Ned raced off right away. They found themselves standing in front of another Iron Man suit, only this time, the small plaque said it was the real deal and not a replica like those downstairs. "Dude, this is so cool," Ned said as he got as close as he could without pressing his face. "I know, right? I mean, I get to see some of the newest stuff in person," Peter whispered, "but this is like the original Mark IV." The two walked along the outside ring of the floor first, taking in the sights of the streets below at the same time as they admired more Iron Man suits. They even came across the occasional Stark item that had either been scrapped right after inception or smaller things from the other heroes, such as an older version of Hawkeye's arrows, a prototype shield that Howard Stark had thought up before vibranium had been introduced, and even a small, black, bug-like object that Black Widow had used for tailing people. Once they walked the perimeter of the floor, they finally stepped into the middle of the large room where there were false walls and rooms that were made of simple white boards to separate things by section. At one point, the two came across another Iron Man suit that had been strung up so that one could view it as it would look when flying. The two friends gushed over it like the nerdy teens they were, and smiles never left their faces. From just in between the suit legs, as Peter was looking up at it from below, he got another view of the floors above, and once again, he thought he spotted someone looking down at him. Peter frowned and tried calling Ned's attention to it, but when he turned back to look, the figure was gone once more. The weird feeling in Peter's stomach would not go away, and though he did not feel like he was in a hostile situation since his spider sense had not gone off, Peter thought was still weird and just plain creepy. He did not get a good look at the person both times, but he was sure that they were at least wearing a baseball cap like Steve had worn, though this one had been black. The figure had also appeared quite androgynous in both slim figure and their clothing choice, making it all the more difficult for Peter to guess who it might have been. Ignoring it once more, or at least trying to, Peter dragged Ned over to the next section. This time, they crossed paths with Erin. As she had said before, she was casually walking around the objects displayed and giving a bit of extra info to Mr. Johnson and the remaining 3 students that had decided to not walk off on their own. Noticing that she was headed down an aisle that they had not yet been to, Peter and Ned traded a look before shrugging and following the redhead. She spoke about some of the other inventions that Tony had made throughout the last few years and even mentioned a few bits of information on those objects that were not common knowledge. Overall, the 2 friends found it fun and interesting to take a bit of time to slowly admire a few things displayed instead of rushing off at the nearest shiny thing. At one point, Flash came wandering over by himself and made a few remarks to Peter and Ned about their Legos again. He eyed objects like the rest of them with wonder, but anytime he lost interest, he would seek out the 2 of them to fill his boredom. Mostly, however, he kept badgering Peter, trying to get him to talk about Stark Industries. He started off by questioning if Peter really was an intern working in such an important place, and Peter just meekly nodded. Flash reluctantly agreed with the fact once Erin stopped talking long enough to face Flash and confirmed that Peter was indeed an intern. Flash grumbled a bit at Erin's back after she turned around to continue talking. Peter realized that Flash still had no idea about his clearance level, however, and the young hero was all too glad to keep it that way. When everyone was enraptured by another object that Erin was speaking about, Flash glanced at Peter once again and started badgering about how Peter must have done something to sneak in or buy his way into his position. He and Ned tried their best to ignore the bully's words and tried to stick close to Erin and Mr. Johnson. Flash tended to say whatever was on his mind with no filter, and eventually, Mr. Johnson began hearing parts of what he had to say. The teacher would either glare at Flash and tell him to behave, or he would direct him away from the group for a moment to talk to him one-on-one. Peter was not sure how well the talks went, since Flash would come back and stay quiet for a moment or 2 before saying something again to Peter. Peter knew that Mr. Johnson was trying his best, but it was frustrating to see that Flash was basically getting away with a verbal slap to the wrist when he was making remarks. It was still annoying to be asked why he was a liar for saying he worked here and then being mocked about how he got the position. Peter would repeatedly say that he got in on recommendation, but Flash would simply shrug his shoulders, saying that if he gave Peter the benefit of the doubt, there was no way that he was anything better than a cleaning boy who took care of the toilets on the lower levels. All the while, when Peter would do everything in his power to get Flash to stop bugging him, he would catch Erin looking their way and stopping her speech for just a second or 2. When she would catch Peter's eye, she would turn back to the small group and continue speaking until Flash said something else, when she would look over once more. It was a small blessing when Flash finally got bored of both pestering the 2 friends and listening to Erin talk. He walked away soon enough, and the group resumed their tour, while Peter and Ned were glad to not have to listen to Flash's voice anymore. They also enjoyed being able to get to know a bit more about Erin when she spoke about stuff that were clearly interesting to her, and surprisingly, Mr. Johnson. He eagerly spoke about a few things that he was familiar with in the lineup of objects as they walked through the small maze that was the 27th floor. One small hand-sized item that had been Howard Stark's idea of a portable phone all the way back in the late 60s had apparently been Mr. Johnson's thesis for when he had graduated from MIT. He happily recounted a few details that he remembered from his paper, and Erin gave smiles and nods in agreement with what he said, making Peter feel impressed that he had someone kind of cool for a teacher. The impressed feeling left when he saw that familiar head once again over Mr. Johnson's shoulder before they melted back into the crowd. The figure was apparently done being on the floor above and was now closer to Peter. The mix of feelings did not leave him at seeing the mystery person. 1 time, it is odd. 2 times, it is a coincidence. 3 times, it is a pattern and almost certainly intentional. Anger overtook any other emotion, and having enough with being stalked, Peter briskly headed over, leaving Erin's small tour. Or at least, he tried to, but this part of the floor was filled with a lot of foot traffic and the crowd was hard to weave his way through. At one point, he heard Ned call his name and his brief panting as he rushed to follow his friend. The flow of the crowd pulled Peter away from where he last saw the person, and he wound up both losing the person and landing near the elevators. The short-lived anger left him when he lost sight, and the young hero simply sighed in exasperation. He turned when he heard Ned had caught up. "Dude, what's the hurry?" "Sorry, Ned. I thought I had a stalker or something and I was going to confront them." "A stalker? Pete, you can't run off on your own then. What if you got kidnapped?" Ned reached out to put hand on Peter's shoulder as though confirming for himself that his best friend was still in front of him. You do remember who you're talking to, right? I'm on the web." "Oh, right. But that doesn't mean that you're invincible, you know. Just be safer for my own sanity, please." With tilted eyebrows, Peter gave a breathy laugh in apology. "Right. Sorry for scaring you, man." Peter then turned back around, planning to go back to searching once more, but was stopped as he suddenly bumped into someone. He gave an ungraceful oomph at the impact and squeezed his eyes on reflex. A familiar sound, and grabbed one of Peter's shoulders to stop herself from falling back. "Hey, you two okay?" Ned asked from behind before he stepped to the side to see who he had collided with. That was when Peter finally recovered and opened his eyes to a mass of strawberry blonde hair right in front of him. The hair moved away suddenly as the woman stood to her full height and a very familiar face filled his vision, though her eyes were only on his for a fraction of a moment before she looked down at a phone in her hand. "I'm sorry," her kind voice said as a hand grabbed his shoulder again, as through seeing as he was still in one piece. "I didn't see you there." The woman finally looked up from the device as she put it down on a handful of documents that rested in her arms, and her eyes widened in surprise as well. "Oh, Peter," Pepper Potts said as she took a step back in surprise and straightened out her suit jacket. "Miss Potts, what are you doing here?" Peter blurted out the first thought that passed through his mind. "Hi Miss Potts," Ned happily said with a small wave and a grin as he briefly interrupted. Pepper turned to him with her own small smile. "Hello again, Ned." The teen gave a quiet squeak in happiness that Peter was sure only he could hear. He fondly rolled his eyes at Ned's antics. "Just doing some security thing, don't worry," Pepper finally said in response to Peter's question. "Wait," she paused her thoughts as she looked Peter up and down once more with a frown before realization lit up upon her face. "Oh, I didn't realize that the red badge they were talking about was you," she mumbled to herself, though Peter easily heard. When her words connected, he said, "What, you know I'm red?" As soon as the words left his mouth, Peter realized how stupid that sounded. Of course Pepper Potts, the CEO of Stark Industries, would know everyone who had a red badge, seeing as there were only 8 people in the whole world who had one. It seemed that she also took his words as an odd thing, as she gave another look with a raised eyebrow and a playful grin before she spoke once more. "I sure do, Pete." "But what are you doing here then? What's the security problem? Can I help?" he eagerly asked as he let the sarcastic tone wash right over him. "Actually, you're kind of the security thing." "Really?" Peter and Ned simultaneously. Pepper gave a nod. "I got a call from one of my assistants. Apparently, he got a call from another yellow holder who said that a green holder said that there was something going on with a red holder and that I should be notified." The long string of words did not help Peter's confusion, and he knew that his face said so when Pepper calmed down and gave a tilt of her eyebrows. "Sorry, Pete. I meant that there was some back and forth about there being a problem about harassment and that I should be made aware." "Oh," Peter said as he remembered what he had just been doing before he ran into the woman. "Yeah. Actually there is something going on. There's some weirdo that I've seen looking at me and Ned. I mean, I think it was because of me, but now that I think about it, maybe they were watching Ned." "Wait, what?" Ned eloquently asked as his eyes widened in worry. "I'm the target?" Pepper mimicked his worry as she turned back to Peter. "There's someone watching you, Peter?" Yeah. I mean, isn't that what you said you were here for?" "No, I said that I got a call that someone filled a report about there being a problem about harassment. And I got roped into is because it was someone with a red clearance. I actually couldn't believe it at first considering who all had red, but it's always better to be safe than sorry." "Hey," Peter said as he frantically waved his arms in a weird fashion. "I'm not harassing anyone, I swear, Pepper." The worried look was genuine, and Pepper tried her hardest to now laugh at his confusion. "No, I didn't mean that you were harassing someone, I meant that someone else was harassing you." "Oh." Peter happily slumped his shoulders at those words before he straightened up when he realized it was the other way around. Yeah, no I don't think that I'm being harassed. I don't know where you got that information, but don't worry Ms. Potts, I'm okay. Like I said, It was just some weirdo looking at me from a distance." "Are you sure?" she said as she clutched her papers in one arm and let the other cup his shoulder. Pepper gave a brief squeeze to show her support and Peter shifted as he gave shrug. "Pretty sure." "I beg to differ," a voice said from off to the side from where they were standing. The three all turned to see Erin standing there with a mild look of frustration on her face. "Erin, there you are," Pepper said in greeting as the other woman walked up to them. After his small crash into Pepper, she had been smart enough to drag her and the two teens over to a wall where they could have a bit of privacy. It seemed as though Erin had either finished or stopped her tour of the room as none of the other students and Mr. Johnson were around her. Peter spotted a few of them nearby looking at another exhibit and they were at least far enough away as to not hear what they were talking about should they try to listen in. The darker redhead nodded her head. "Hello, Ms. Potts." "Oh, no need for that. Pepper is just fine." Erin gave a smile and nod in understanding before she turned back to Peter. "And sorry to say, Mr. Parker, but I believe I know what I saw, so don't deny it." "Deny what?" the teen asked, genuinely not knowing what his tour guide was speaking about. He looked over to Ned to see what if he knew the answer, but he just gave a shrug of his own shoulders. "That Thompson kid. He's a real piece of work and I had the unfortunate privilege of hearing him say quite a few rude things to you and Mr. Leeds." "Oh, really?" Pepper asked as she turned back to Peter with a hand on her hip. He refused to look at her and instead thought the wall behind her was very interesting. "Oh, that? Yeah, that's no big deal. I'm used to that. It's okay, really." When he turned back, he was greeted to the two women glaring at him with arms on their hips. The sight did nothing to ease his nerves and Pepper seemed to notice that as she quickly dropped her unoccupied hand and moved towards him again. He eventually felt himself wrapped in her arms and he caught scent of her familiar perfume. It was relaxing, and Peter felt himself lightly placing his hands on her back in a brief hug. "Pete, what's going on?" she asked once she pulled back. "It's like I said, Pepper, nothing I can't handle," Peter said, switching to calling her by her first name. It helped him feel a bit better, talking to the woman as an ant-like figure instead of a boss. "Well, it sounds to me like you aren't handling it and instead are just letting it happen when something could be done to stop it." "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is, Peter. If someone is bullying you, I want to be able to help you. And how would you feel if you knew that just Ned was being picked on and he never said anything to you?" He looked over to see Ned looking at him with pursed lips that gave away how much he agreed with Pepper. His begging eyes told him that Ned wanted Peter to say something. "I would feel horrible." "Okay, I see your point, but Pepper," Peter paused as he spared a pointed look at Erin. "I kinda figured it would be best to leave it alone considering a few things." He hoped he's got his point across about not saying everything because Erin was still there and she did not know his second identity. It worked, and Pepper snuck a glance at the other redhead before she turned back to Peter and gave a nod. "Hey, Erin?" "Yes, Pepper? If you don't mind, I would like to speak with Peter and Ned alone. Thank you for feeling something about this and grabbing my attention." "It's no problem. I hope you're not mad at me for doing something," she said as she turned back to Peter. Peter lifted a shoulder in a half shrug. "It's okay, I guess. Flash is a jerk, so Sawyer do something eventually." Erin narrowed her eyes and said, "I would use something stronger than jerk," as she turned around and headed back to find some of her tour group. Pepper gave a laugh and nodded in agreement before she turned back to the matter at hand. "All right, Pete. Tell me what's going on, please. And don't think you can get out of this time." He and Ned traded a look of uncertainty. They had never really told an adult before about Flash. Sure, Peter complained about him to May, but his aunt just knew the guy as some loudmouth in that he shared a few classes with. The two friends had a silent conversation with eyebrow movements, eyelids, and shoulders. It was slightly amusing for Pepper, but after more than a few minutes of their silent display, she put her foot down as told them someone better start talking. "Well, I guess, Flash is some guy at school that likes to, make fun of us." "And what words does he use to make fun?" "Oh, you know, the regular stuff I guess. It's no big deal." "No, I don't know. Enlighten me, please," Pepper said as she impatiently began tapping the floor with one of heeled shoes. It seemed that Ned had enough of Peter's eggshell walking and blurted out, "He calls me dead because it rhymes with dead, and he always calls me fat or something else about my weight. And he calls Peter penis," thinking it's hilarious and even tried to get in fights with Peter sometimes. "He does what?" Pepper almost shouted as she leaned in to make sure no one else could listen in on their conversation. "Dude," Peter said as he turned to Ned. "Sorry, man, but I just can't take it anymore. You should be sticking up for yourself for a lot of reasons. I mean, to be fair, I should be too. But he freaking tries to get in fights with you. Man, we are all not kids anymore, and Flash needs to grow up, and if he can't do that on his own, then someone else needs to do it for him." "Thank you, Ned. Couldn't have said it better myself. Though I have to add in there that you should also not let this slide because you think you're Spider-Man and Spider-Man can take it or deal with some bully. You're Peter Parker too, and no matter who you are, no one deserved to be verbally or physically picked on." The teen looked back and forth between Ned and Pepper, biting his lip in thought. He finally took in a deep breath and let it out slowly through his nose. "All right." "All right," Pepper egged on. "All right, you can help. Or, I mean, I would like help, please, in dealing with maybe a minor problem that I am having concerning a fellow student." "Peter, don't try to make this sound all formal or something just so that you can take away from how serious this is. It's not a minor problem and I want to help you solve this in the first place. Please let me." He rubbed his damp hands on his jeans as he looked down briefly before finding Pepper's eyes again. "Okay. And I mean it this time, Pep. I don't want to be a verbal or physical punching bag anymore, and I don't want to see my best friend be teased because of his name or his weight or his love for Legos. I want to be able to graduate like a normal person who does not have to deal with looking behind their back all the time in the halls because some jackass wants to call me names or push me into lockers." Pepper's smile was a bit shaky and her eyes were watery, but her entire behind radiated how proud she was of Peter for saying such words. She opened her arms in invitation, and Peter easily stepped into her embrace, once again catching the scent of her perfume. He peeked over her shoulder and saw Ned giving him his own large smile and a thumbs up. "Okay," she said as she pulled back. Her posture reverted back to business mode and she gave a nod to herself as though mentally reverting as well. "I need to go back to work for a few more hours, but when I am done, around 4 o'clock, I will start working this out. Maybe I'll call the school or something. Pull a few strings as the CEO of this place. Whatever I need to do, Peter, I will do it to help you and Ned." Peter and Ned gave her twin grins at those words and they hugged her at the same time. "Thank you, Pep." "Yeah, thanks Miss Potts. Well, you're lucky that Tony is in an important meeting right now. If he wasn't, you can bet that I would be calling him right this second to talk all about this and hash out a plan." "Are you going to be calling him after the meeting? You know me so well, Peter," she said with a sly smirk. "Great," he mumbled, "now he'll know I'm here for sure. Just please convince him to not come and find me. If he does, I don't want to be mortified by anything he might try to do to push my buttons. And even though I kind of do want him to do something to Flash, please tell him not to. You know I can't promise something like that, Pete. Do you know who you're talking about?" "Yeah." He closed his eyes as he gave a deep sigh of acceptance. "How about promising me that you'll talk to him, so he won't do something completely embarrassing?" "Sorry again, Peter. I'll try my best because I know how much you want to be a normal high schooler, but I can give no promises. Also, you shouldn't spend the whole time worrying about something like that. He's going to be in the meeting for at least another hour or two. So maybe luck will be on your side and you'll be able to leave with your class without any problems." Ned gave a laugh then. The two looked to him in question. "We all know we're talking about Peter, right? When has luck ever been on his side when it comes to avoiding any kind of trouble?" Pepper laughed outright at that, gaining a few looks from passerbys. A few did a double take, not completely sure that they were seeing the CEO of Stark Industries in front of them, standing next to two teenage boys. Peter, on the other hand, lightly shoved his best friend at his words. Ned went with the motion and took a step back with a large grin. Peter felt a reflection of the smile grow on his own face as he turned back to wave Pepper goodbye. He felt like a long overdue weight was finally lifted off his shoulders. Pepper left soon after that. Before the elevator doors could close on her face, however, she used 2 fingers to gesture to her eyes, then towards Peter, telling the teen quite clearly that she would be watching him. Whether that was a warning for him to behave or a gesture for him to take comfort in, he did not know. She also quickly mouthed, "Keep an eye out for Tony," before the doors finally closed. His smile fell away at that reminder. Peter was not sure how he should be currently feeling concerning the billionaire, but he just let an accepting sigh escape him as he turned back to Ned. Come on, we should probably get back to the tour. Ned gave Peter a sympathetic pat to his back. Don't worry, man. I bet Mr. Stark will be cool when we see him. Geez, thanks Ned. Instead of giving me the false sense of security of getting through all this without seeing Mr. Stark, you just go and say that he'll be cool when he shows up. Ned gave an unapologetic smile. What can I say? I know you too well. You should just be glad that Ms. Potts is going to be taking care of it. Well, at least most of it. Don't remind me, and I can't even tell you how wrong you are. Mr. Stark is so going to try to do something about all of this. Ned said as he lifted his eyes up and thought. I wonder if I should be feeling sort of worried for Flash. Peter looked up and thought as well. In almost complete synchronization, the two friends looked back down to face each other and said, "Nah," with a wave of their hands. They wound up snickering to each other at their unplanned action when they got close to Erin and her small group. She gave them a smile and it made Peter realize that she was probably happy to see that they had likely gotten the issue with Pepper solved. After that, time seemed to move a bit quicker as she eagerly went back to giving her small group a tour. The 30 minutes ended and once more, everyone was gathered in front of the elevators. There were no problems this time and all 17 of them easily fit in at the same time. With all the shuffling as the group made their way in, it unfortunately left Peter and Ned in one corner of the elevator with Flash. The two spotted him give a nasty look as he eventually made his way past them and stood in the back right behind the two friends. Peter constantly felt Flash's gaze on the back of his head and the hairs on Peter's neck stood directly straight up. As soon as Erin had placed her badge on the sensor and the lift moved, everyone shifted slightly as the machine began to ascend. Flash had gone with the motion and had quite obviously bumped into the two of them rather harshly and caused a few others to turn to look at the sound of Peter, Ned, and Flash's shuffling feet. Erin was one of those pairs of eyes and when Flash saw her look, he hastily made an empty apology to Peter and Ned, and simply gave the excuse that he had lost his footing. Peter was almost certain that no one believed him, but no one did anything to out the lie either. The young hero was also fairly confident that his classmates were split in half when it came to not getting in Flash's way so that they could stay on his good side. Peter knew that no matter which side his peers were on, that did not mean that they felt any sympathy for Peter and Ned. In Midtown, it was practically common knowledge that students like Peter and Ned were the smart ones who were also the losers for being interested in different things. Peter always known, even before he accepted Tony's fake internship, that there were only a handful of people in his entire school who did not think he and Ned were total nobodies. Even within that small group of people, only so many believed that Peter worked in the SI building after Flash had accidentally leaked that bit of information. In fact, of the handful of people that could be considered on Peter and Ned's side in the whole school, some of them were his classmates that were currently in the lift. He was not so sure about Samantha being a person that he would consider being on his side, seeing as she was known to bounce from one thought to the next and could be easily swayed with just a few words, but one that Peter was almost sure of was Jason Wolfe. Jason had known Peter and Ned ever since they were in grade 7 together. He was simply the kind of person that did not have a single bad bone in their body. Jason always had a smile on his face and had even made the effort to talk to the two friends occasionally, even when the three of them did not have classes together. Peter was not as close to Jason as he was with Ned, but if his best friend wasn't there way back when the two first met, Peter was almost sure that Jason would have become his man in the chair. Casey O'Brien was another of his peers that Peter thought was a kind soul. She was a bit more timid than the rest, but she was always honest and did her best to smile every day. She tended to trail after Samantha however, and Peter felt that it both hindered the softer girl as well as perhaps swaying her to the thoughts and whims of Samantha as opposed to having her own opinions. Samantha was by no means a rude person or even a bully like Flash, but she did tend to be a bit strong-minded and a no-nonsense kind of person. Peter had been around a few times in the halls, passing her by when she would get into heated arguments with whoever was around, be it fellow student or teacher. Either way, Jason and Casey were two people that Peter appreciated having around to help him tolerate his time at school. They were kind around him and never let the gossip and rumor mill affect how they thought of Peter and Ned, and the two were very grateful for that. His thoughts drifted away from him once more as the elevators signaled their arrival. As one, The group stepped off once more and Aaron led them back out the hall that held the lifts, and the small group was greeted the sight of a large rectangular glass railing. Almost every student eagerly rushed forward to place their hands upon the rail and look down to the bottom floors where they had just been. A few stayed behind with Mr. Johnson, obviously scared of the visible height, and were happy to let the rest of them peer down. As you can see, Aaron began once more, "We are on the 5th floor of this museum. This is floor 31, and though it is still technically a part of the Trinkets Hall, this place also goes by a second name. Can any of you guys based on what you see?" Those last words forced Peter to tear his eyes away from the people and sights down below, and to look up across the large gap. The first thing he noticed was that there were not as many people up here as there were on the lower floors of the museum. Not knowing if it was a security thing or something else, Peter let the thought drift away, but he focused on the objects that were displayed all around him. It seemed like a mess at first. There were a lot of different things that stood out, like a metal mask, a bedazzled-looking necklace, and oddly enough, some dentures with sharpened teeth. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason to everything that Peter could see from where he stood, and he was almost certain that he would not be any closer if he got the chance to walk around for a minute to get a better idea. Lots of stuff, Hall?" Flash asked. "Well, there is a lot of stuff, I will give you that, but nope. Anyone else?" "A whole bunch of things, Hall," Trent asked. "Nice try, but no again. Anyone else?" "No? Well, I can't blame you for giving up. It's a bit of a funny one that most would probably not know." "I bet Parker knows," Flash interrupted. "Right, Parker?" Knowing that he would sound like a broken record if he opened his mouth to simply reply with a "no," Peter just shook his head and tried to avoid eye contact. Aaron spared a glacé between the two of them with thinned lips before she turned back to the group. "The top floor of this large museum collection had the nickname of Badass Souvenirs. I'm sure I don't have to say who gave it that name, do I?" A FS showed that everyone knew almost right away who created such a name. Peter felt his own laugh escape as he pictured Tony causally leaning against the glass railing, looking around with everything set up and just thinking aloud, "Look at all these badass souvenirs we've collected over all our fights." His thoughts kept him away from Aaron's small speech, and Peter let his eyes drift around as he let her voice be a sort of background noise. The things he could see displayed were quite different in a lot of ways, but after realizing that they were mementos from things the Avengers had taken, Peter began noticed a few familiar things. Most were from missions that he had been on, but he also took notice of how one side of the floor was familiar from way back when the Avengers were first brought together. It was also how Peter realized that the place was apparently organized to be like a timeline. Newer things were on his right, with the whole room shifting back in time the further he looked to his left. Peter did not know how to feel when he realized that he recognized more things from when he was a fan as opposed to now when he was part of the team. That was also when Peter saw a familiar figure standing in a corner of the large room. Standing slightly behind another faux wall that divided parts of the museum into smaller sections, was the back of that shadowy person from earlier. They were walking around a few of the older things that not a lot of casual fans might have recognized. It was his stalker. Like before, the figure was rather slim, giving off the androgyny that Peter had thought about earlier. With their back turned, he still could not tell who they were, and that previous adrenaline rush came back as he wanted to figure out who was spying on him. Was it an enemy? Maybe it was a competitor with SI that was trying to get to someone like Pepper or Tony? Maybe they needed a red holder then. It would make sense to follow him at least. But only so many people have that knowledge from when FRIDAY announced it back at the security checkpoint. Perhaps it is a villain also after Tony, or some information that the Avengers have on the underground world. But then that would mean that they would know Peter's secret if they were following him. All these thoughts had flown through Peter's mind too quickly, and yet, in that time, Aaron must have finished speaking as he noticed everyone splitting up and moving every which way to look at the displays. He spared a look around as he watched everyone move, but Peter felt himself gravitating back to the figure. When he looked back, the person had moved slightly, and Peter could almost get a peek of their profile. Their hat cast them in a shadow, but Peter got a good look of at least one eye staring directly at him from almost halfway across the entire room. Goosebumps grew along Peter's arms right away at their gaze. A hand fell on his shoulder, and though he would never admit it aloud, he jumped at the feeling. He turned to give Ned a glare since he took Peter's attention off the weirdo. "Dude, come on. Aaron said we can see whatever we want, and I want to go look at those awesome-looking rings over there," Ned said as he pointed in the general direction of where the stalker was. Not knowing if it was good or bad luck, Peter looked back over to see the person still lurking around over there but also moving around, as though trying to blend in a bit more. "Yup. Sure. Let go," Peter eagerly said as he grabbed Ned's wrist to quickly drag him over to the rings that he had pointed out. The two wound up very interested in the odd-looking rings. A plaque nearby said that they had belonged to some villain who had used them to attract people to do their bidding by falling in love with whoever was wearing the rings and had the rings touch them. There was even a fun anecdote about how Thor had been captured before the team could defeat the woman who had been wearing the jewelry. Peter eventually had to remind himself that this was not the main reason of why he came over here, and once more, he searched out the person, hoping to solve this once and for all. Ned was still occupied with the rings and a few things nearby. Letting him do his own thing for a minute, since Peter hoped to get this over and done with as soon as he could, Peter snuck away when Ned had his face almost pressed against the glass case. He wandered around a few other things, taking them in his peripheral as he tried to spot the figure. Thinking he might have missed his chance, Peter sighed internally, and as he turned back to Ned, he finally saw them again. Wasting no more time, and finding luck was on his side with the person hidden away in a corner where they could talk in private in case the person was a lunatic or even a violent person, he rushed over. Shoulders hunched and spine straight, the teen hoped to look a bit more intimidating than he currently felt as he kept walking closer and closer, ready for this confrontation. The height of the person was a bit taller than the hero had previously thought, but he did not let it stop him from reaching out to their shoulder when he finally got close enough. He might have been a bit more forceful than was necessary, but who could blame the teen? This was a person that had obviously been following him for a while now, and Peter had had enough. "Whoa there," a slightly deep voice said as they were twirled around. At least that confirmed that the person was most likely male. With his determination still clouding his thoughts, Peter kept the frown on his face as he demanded, "Why are you following me?" "Dang, little dude. I figured that I was already caught when I saw you looking at me, but why you gotta say it like I'm the bad guy?" "Oh, I don't know, how about because you're some creep in all black walking around following a teenager? Who are you? Who do you work for? You a villain? Corporate competitor? A predator?" "A predator? Jesus, Pete, who do you think I am?" The voice had shifted from a deep confident tone to downright mortified and even a bit higher in pitch. "A stalker, that's what," Peter said as he grabbed the male's upper arm and squeezed it in his anger. "Hey," he said as he tried to pull of Peter's hand. "Pete, stop. How do you know my name anyways?" The man moved his hand away from his numbing shoulder to quickly pull off his hat. "Geez, Peter, if you didn't recognize me, you should have just said so." Clint Barton stashed the hat under his arm as he ruffled his hair and once again dropped his hand atop Peter's in hope of recovering his arm. "Wah," Peter said as he stepped back with wide eyes and an open mouth. His hand fell from away from Clint and it weakly swung back down to his side. "Clint?" The volume of Peter's voice was embarrassingly loud in the large room. There were people around talking enough to drown out a bit of the shout, but Peter's surprise got the best of him, making a few people start looking around their general direction to see what caused such a tone. Peter lowered his eyes and felt a rush of blood rise at so many looks from complete strangers and even a few from his classmates. He even felt Clint freeze up a bit at all the attention. This time, it was Clint's hand on Peter's shoulder, causing the teen to look up at him. "Come on, we can talk over there," the archer said with a tilt of his head to another section that had a lot less people around. By this point, however, Peter also heard the distinct sound of Ned's voice calling for Peter and asking where he ran off to. He halted in following Clint, feeling the older man's hand slip away from his shoulder as Peter tried to look around to find where Ned's voice was coming from. The large teen finally rounded a wall, most likely following Peter's shout, and his face lit up at finally finding Peter. His eyes shifted over to Clint and Ned seemed to do a double take. He blinked a few times as though also not completely seeing Clint in the figure that stood before him before another amazed smile grew upon his face as he jogged the last few steps over Int were standing. "Damn Peter, what's with all the heroes coming out of the woodwork around here?" "Beats me," Peter replied with a weak shrug and an equally weak smile. "All the heroes? Who else has been around? I swear, if Thor or Sam have been down here already, Someone is going to have to answer to me," Clint interrupted after he waved to Ned in greeting. "Why are you worried about those two? Because they are my greatest competitors when it comes to me being the fun one." "Wait. Hold on just a sec," Peter said as he waved his hands around as a sign to stop talking. "Are you implying that they are going to show up at one point or another while I am on this freaking school field trip?" Clint made a wiggle motion with his shoulders as he let them quickly rise and fall in a fast shrug. "Can't say that I know for sure. I was just guessing, but they better not, because they might do something entertaining and ruin my reputation of being cool." "And why are you the fun one?" Ned asked. "Yeah," Peter nodded. "I don't know if I would call you cool, Clint. Maybe funny but not cool." "Hey," Clint gave a small pout at those words before he replied, "because those two other lugs are nothing but muscle." "Do you think they can do this?" Clint then proceeded to bend backwards onto his hand. He swiftly transitioned to a handstand and then let his legs fall back too as he completed the slow backflip with an exaggerated pose with his arms out and his nose stuck in the air. "Hey, quit that," Peter harshly whispered as he looked around. "Why do you have go all circus on me in public?" "Public? We're in the tower." "Well, yeah, but not a tower. You're in a freaking museum. What if you knocked something over?" "Okay, I see your point. But I am always aware of my surroundings, you know that, little dude." Clint then proceeded to extend an arm all the way out and it stopped just right in front of a glass display that held an expensive-looking goblet. Peter and Ned could not help but jump slightly at the speed at which Clint moved and how close he came to almost breaking the case. Peter glared at the archer. "Don't scare us like that, with me here. I just know that if you did break something, Tony would come complaining to me and not you." Clint simply replied with a smug grin. "Why were you following me anyways?" Peter then said once he realized that he had lost his previous train of thought. "It's been pretty weird and creepy just seeing you skulk around like that. Why do you think I hounded you with all those questions?" Clint finally gave a look that spoke of guilt. Ned and Peter traded a look, finally happy to figure out why the older man had been shadowing them. "I might have been given a small assignment, which is..." Clint looked away and puckered his lips in a childlike manner. He shifted his eyes back to look at Peter and Ned, then looked back. "Let's just say, red heads can be real scary when they go in mama bear mode." Having a vague idea of who he was talking about, but still not knowing 100% seeing as he now knew 3 scary redheads, Peter gulped before he dared ask the question. And would this redhead happen to be able to take down a small fleet all by herself? Clint simply nodded. Peter sighed. Ned gave a small squeal as he brought his hands up to his cheeks in wonder when he realized who they were talking about. "Well then why isn't she following me around? Why you?" "Because she told me, and I quote, 'I am the brains and you should do the physical labor and take a few pounds off,' and do you really think I could ignore her when she's like that?" With a sigh, Peter folded his arms. "No, I guess not. But what's the reason for her being in mama bear mode?" "She probably just wants to make sure that your classmates are actually teenagers just on a tour and there's no villain or something that is playing the part. Just wants to make sure that you're protected while you're at home, ya know?" Internally, there were butterflies in his stomach and a fast heart gave away how happy those words made him, but outside, Peter tried to keep a straight face as he tried to show how calm he was with the situation. It was nice to hear how concerned Natasha was with his well-being and how much Clint agreed with her, seeing as he was currently standing right in front of Peter. The feelings felt even better after hearing the older hero call this place home, implying that it was such for the both of them and everyone else. "Yeah, I guess," Peter finally said as he gave a small smile. "So, what, you've been tailing Peter ever since we got here and you're going to keep doing that for the whole trip?" Ned asked once there was a break of silence between the two. Clint looked over to Ned and gave a smile, another simple shrug of his shoulders. "Well, I only just caught up to you guys when you got here at the museum. I've had a busy day, let me tell you. But yeah, I guess I'll be here for the whole thing. I mean, Nat's the one that's good at all the tailing stuff. I'm better in the air, but I guess I can make do." "Yeah, we know," Peter muttered. "But why did you have to be so creepy about it?" Ned as he talked over Peter's quiet mumblings. "I mean, we clearly caught you looking at us a few times, and with those clothes, you should be thankful that Peter's an idiot and didn't think to call security or the cops." Clint rubbed the back of his head and gave a feeble smile. "Yeah, about that. It was just easier on me that way. I didn't care if you knew I was watching you guys. That's the one that wanted it to be a discreet thing. But I had to be close enough to you in case something did happen and I could act on it. Also, it's just easier on the eyes if I am closer so I don't have to try real hard to read everyone's lips." The two friends traded a look as though not completely believing Clint's story. Or at least knowing that he was intentionally leaving something out of his tale. "Well, since I now know you're here, can you cool it with the stalker-like moves?" "I guess, sorry little dude, I can try something else, but I won't always be near you then, that okay?" "Hey, I'm not the paranoid one here. Go ask your partner in crime for that answer. And besides, I know these guys. Some are a real piece of work, but they're harmless, regular high schoolers. And even though I am just regular old Peter Parker right now, I can still take care of myself. I've got a red badge apparently." "I suppose," Clint said as he looked Peter and Ned up and down in thought before he gave a wolfish smile. "But I bet you don't even know what that means, huh my little intern?" Peter glared back at the grin. "And I'm betting that you won't tell me?" "Nope," Clint said with a pop at the end of the word. "And why not?" "Because I want to watch you suffer in curiosity," the deaf hero said in an exaggerated manner as he raised his hands up to squish Peter's cheeks. He tried to move away from the action. It reminded him too much of Aunt May when he had been younger and she would always pinch and squish his face. But Peter could not help the small burst of laughter that escaped at the situation he was in. Who in their right mind would ever think that one day, boring Peter Parker would become friends with a hero like Hawkeye and that such a hero would want to do something as silly and casual as pushing Peter's cheeks inward while they stood in the middle of a museum in the old Avengers Tower. Peter finally batted away the hands from his face. "Fine, I'll suffer, but so will you. Now that I know you're stuck on babysitting duty, I can say or do things that you won't be able to avoid since you have to follow us around." "Great. Thanks for that, Pete. You really are a mini Stark, ya know." "Peter, you better take that as a compliment," Ned warned his best friend with an eager tone. "Yeah, I agree with Ned. I'll take that as a compliment." "Ah, my mini Stark," Clint said as he raised a pinky to the corner of his mouth and raised an eyebrow. Peter and Ned gave him a weird look and Clint pouted as he brought, "You too young to get that reference?" They nodded their heads. The archer hero slumped his head down as he muttered to himself, "Man, I'm old. So what are you going to do now that you're not allowed to follow me around like a creepy shadow?" "Don't worry, Peter, I'll still keep an eye on y'all even you can't keep an eye on me." "Oh no, what do you mean by that?" Clint leaned in as he cupped his hands around his mouth as though telling a great big secret. Too curious to pass up whatever he was going to say, Peter leaned in as he moved his head to the side, letting Clint cup around his ear and he whispered, "The vents are always your friends." The younger male leaned back at that and rolled his eyes dramatically when he knew Clint was looking at him. "They may be your friends, but not mine. Seriously, how do you even fit?" "Tony is very understanding, my little spider. And they're your friends too. You do know what air conditioning vents are actually used for, right?" "Of course I do." "Do you?" "Yup. But that doesn't mean I can't have my fun crawling all around in them. It's comfy. I really need to get you to try it come of these days." "Pass." "Oh, come on, please." "No, pretty please." "No thank you. What if I call you, my little dude?" "You already do call me that and I am used to it." "What about, princess?" What? It's not working. I thought that maybe you would be too embarrassed to be called that and you would want to do whatever to get me to stop calling you that." "Oh. Well, it didn't work. Then I'll just have to drag you into the vents one of these days when you are none the wiser." "You mean like dragging him into the vents like in some scary movie?" Ned asked with a worried look to his face. Peter spared him a sympathetic look. Ned hated anything involving scary movies or television shows. "Yes," Clint said as he rubbed his hands together as he got lost in his thoughts. Ned and Peter looked at one another with a shared expression of uneasiness. They turned around then at the sound of Aaron's voice drifting back towards the corner the three of them were in. It seemed as though their time was up for looking around the floor. Ned slumped his shoulders, upset that he missed his chance to look at everything and take some pictures. Peter felt sorry for his best friend while he also felt a bit bummed out to have spent the whole time talking instead of looking around. Clint finally calmed down when he saw the way the two teens had turned around at whatever they had heard. He followed their line of sight to see Erin standing near the glass railing and calling back her group. "Looks like that's my K to leave then," he said, causing the friends to turn back to him. "Yeah, I guess so," Peter replied. Do you miss me already, my cute little munchkin? Yuck. Please don't ever call me that again. Sure, just know that while I spend my time today following you guys around in the vents, I will be making a list of new nicknames for you. Goodbye, Clint, Peter said as he tried to ignore his last words and instead grabbed Ned's shoulder to steer him back to their tour. Ned chanced a peek back to the older Avenger and was surprised to see that he was already gone and most likely headed for the nearest vent opening. He told as much to Peter, who turned back as well and then shook his head in exasperation. When they finally walked back to Erin, they realized that they were the last to arrive. When their guide spotted them, she spared a questioning look with a lifted eyebrow but seemed to let it go as she did another head count. Happy with her answer, she then said, "Well, let's go to one more thing and then we can take a lunch break. That sound good?" The replies were a range of eager agreement, seeing as these were teenagers who she was showing around, and it was a known fact that teenagers have bottomless pits for stomachs. They were all corralled back into an elevator, and after hearing that Erin was taking them to floor 55, Peter's interest skyrocketed as he remembered Erin saying that this floor was the one she worked on. They were headed for Erin's personal lab. Floor 55 was completely different than any other floor that the group had been to so far. It was not a typical open-plan floor, and it certainly did not have a half-wall dividing it from a floor above or below. This place was instead what a typical science lab looked like, with secure doors and large window that let observers see what was going on from a safe distance. Erin seemed to look both eager and annoyed to be there. Peter assumed it was because it was still where she typically worked, and sometimes people just have those days where they do not want to go into work. She seemed to take in a breath of air, however, as the group she was leading finally got off the elevator and made their first few steps into the main room. It looked to be a bit like a reception area with a fairly decent-sized room and a small counter with a single woman sitting behind it. Behind the counter there were 3 hallways that forked into differing directions. Peter was eager to see what sort of things were being worked on down each way. Though the sneak peek he got from a window-covered wall showed a few people in similar lab coats to Erin who seemed to be working on something. Erin asked Mr. Johnson to do a quick head count to make sure everyone was still accounted for as she walked up to the seated woman at the counter. Erin leaned forward, resting her folded arms across the top of the surface as she leaned forward and began whispering to woman. Knowing that he was supposed to not be able to hear what was being said but not being able to help himself, Peter let himself listen in. "Hey Erin, doing another tour then? You know it, Rita. I was just wondering what I've missed since this morning. I haven't had the time to check in since I've had to keep an eye out on this rowdy group." Rita gave a small giggle as she hid her smile behind a hand before she turned to her computer. There were only a few taps of the keyboard before Rita turned back to Erin. "Looks like you haven't missed much. Just some of the usual. The Golds did finally give us our prototype for that battery of yours that you've been asking about for a while." "Oh really?" Erin asked in an excited tone. "Finally. I've been looking forward to that for about a week now. I heard that they are a little behind upstairs, so I was thinking that it might be another few days. Now I'm excited to go play with it." Rita leaned to her side to peek over at Peter and his group. "Don't forget that you got some kids with you, Erin." "Oh, right." Erin turned around to follow Rita's eyes as well and spotted Peter looking at them. She gave a small smile and nod. Feeling a bit guilty at being caught even though he knew that Erin had no idea he was been listening in, he turned to Ned to avoid her stare. "Oh, one more thing," Rita said as she leaned forward to Erin as well, closing the gap between them even more as she tried to keep what she said away from the teenagers in the room. "Banner is in the back working on something for Stark. I wasn't told what, but I thought you might want to know that he's here. I don't know if you wanted to have them get to see one of the Avengers in person, seeing as they might never get that chance again." Erin gave a laugh then, and when Rita gave a lifted eyebrow in question, Erin said, "Oh, believe me, they've already had the treat of a lifetime. But you're right. Maybe we'll go look at some other things, and along the way I'll ask Banner if it would be alright for me to swing the group by for a quick hello. They might get to see him work on something cool. Who knows?" she ended with a shrug and a smile. "Great," Rita said with a smile as she turned back to her computer. With their small chat over, Erin turned back to the group and noticed how everyone seemed to almost be vibrating with excitement. Peter was included in that, but who could blame him or his peers? They were in the Stark Tower building, and even then, the small group was getting the privilege to be in one of the best labs in the entire place. Okay you guys, why you step over here with me and we can get going on some of the more fun things to see around here. Erin gave a wave of her hand as she began walking and gestured towards the hallway that led to the right. With the floors being a type of linoleum material, since they were in a lab setting, the surface did not help in keeping their steps quiet. There was no talking, but the air was still filled with the sound of 16 pairs of shoes and one pair of high heels that clicked regularly against the floor. Throughout it all, there was a slight undertone to the constant noise that was bugging Peter a bit. At first, he could not quite place it, but soon enough, Peter realized that what he was hearing, under the walking as the group was led to wherever Erin wanted to show first, was the sound of bending or warped metal. Slightly thin metal at that, and once he connected those dots, Peter's eyes automatically moved up towards the ceiling on their own. He could not spot any physical change to the clearly visible dents, but once they passed underneath a grate, he easily spotted a familiar figure scurry by with this enhanced sight. Right then, Peter wanted to both groan at the absurdity of what he just witnessed as well as laugh outright. Once he realized just what was going on, he truly wanted to do nothing more than just bend over in laughter. Clint had indeed said that he would be following Peter through the vents, but hearing and seeing were such two different things. It was amazing and ridiculous, and Peter could easily admit in the comfort of his own mind that he loved Clint even more for this. As the group finally made it through the long hall that divided the main reception room to the rest of the floor, the small tour group was greeted to another hallway. Only this one was lined with windows that peeked into the various lab rooms that filled the space. A few were empty, and though the others seemed to quickly glaze over them, seemingly bored with not seeing any action, Peter was very much invested. It gave the chance for them to see what it would look like if they were to work there one day. How it was organized would tell a lot about the personality and feelings that the people here regarded their workspace and their level of professionalism. From what Peter could see, it was indeed orderly and sanitary. Nothing seemed out of place, and even more, he could spot a few tools that were organized in a familiar pattern. It seemed as though the employees here took a page out of Tony's instructions and laid out certain tools and equipment to his habits and standards. Finally, Erin stopped in front of one of the windows. This one was occupied with 3 people, all in similar lab coats to the redhead. Here, she began after she knocked on the glass and waved once they saw they had an audience. We have 3 very knowledgeable people who are testing. What you may ask, I actually don't know yet. This seemed to look a new one that even I have not gotten my hands on yet. But I can take a guess. Can any of you? Trent spoke up after raising their hand. I would guess that they are working on some type of droid battery. And can you explain why you think that? Yes, Trent replied as he pointed at the glass wall in the direction behind the person that was the farthest left in the room. There are a few blueprints on that board over there that have flight schematics and equations. There are also a lot of discarded propellers that are in a few bins here and there. Why do you think it is a battery then? Why don't you think that they are working on the actual droid? Because I would recognize that type of battery anywhere. I use them a bit myself since I like to make small planes and droid-like things once in a while. Erin gave a large grin as she nodded her head. Well, you're correct. They are indeed working on a droid battery. Here in this lab, we test out our flight prototypes. Actually, almost this entire floor is dedicated to testing out prototypes. That is what I specialize here at Stark Industotypes, or something specific, Peter asked. Ned nodded his head in agreement as he said, yeah, that seems like a pretty broad thing to work on. You mean that you test out any kind of thing that is a prototype for the company? Yes, Ned, exactly that. There were a few students whose eyes grew large at that bit of information. Casey even muttered a low, wow, that those around her heard and nodded in agreement. Erin tapped the glass then as she spoke next. I know that it seems like a lot to handle. She paused as she gestured to the side of one of the workers. But we're a pretty large team, so we can get stuff done in a fairly decent time frame. The worker seemed to realize what she was trying to say and picked up a different tool before they went back to work. Another fun bit of information for you guys is that this is my specialty. I work with batteries and general power sources. So that battery that you are oh so familiar with, she said as she pointed to Trent, is something that I actually invented for this kind of specific droid type. It seemed that Clint found the perfect time to whisper, badass, and Peter was thankful that it was at a level where only he could hear. Internally he rolled his eyes at the remark, but the teen found himself agreeing with the hidden hero. The process we go through to work on the prototypes is a bit long and complicated, so I don't just give you the quick notes, Basically, if we want to create something for the company, we can write out everything we want and need. We don't make the first thing through. That honor goes to the golds upstairs. Though there are a few times where they might bet swamped in work, and so some of us greens get to work on them. Either way, the golds usually make the first prototype, and then it gets handed down to us where we get to tinker around with Mark 1 and give more notes to give to the golds. If it gets passed, then they send the notes and Mark 1 back to us, and from then on, we get to work on however many marks we want of that thing. When we're done or think we can go as few as we can, we give it back to them. They either polish things up or just hand it right away to Mr. Stark. He oversees everything that comes out of the company still, even though Mrs. Potts is CEO. When Erin was done speaking, she turned back to watch her fellow peers work behind the glass with her group. They spent a few more minutes simply watching them work in silence before Erin soon dragged them off down the hall. They passed a few more large windows in the same hall which held even more smaller labs. Peter began to notice that the further they walked down the hall, the more people were in the various labs on either side of them. He remembered that Erin said that there are a few hundred people with the green badge, but he also thought that there were quite a few floors that they could be spread out on. The amount that he was noticing is nowhere being even close to 50 people yet, so Peter supposed that there were still a lot of people that he had not seen yet. A whole bunch of questions kept springing forth in his mind, but as much as Peter would have loved to voice them, he was still wary of Flash. Peter snuck a glance at the other teenager and saw him fooling around a bit with Sean and his two other goons, Damian Johnson and Christopher Price. It was a bit subtle, and Peter was sure that Mr. Johnson had not even noticed that the four of them were even acting out. It was not too bad, even Peter could admit, but seeing them like that made him a bit worried, seeing as they were on a floor that was a bit more of a safety hazard than where they had been beforehand. Almost as thought feeling eyes on him, Flash turned just enough to catch Peter's eye. He tried to refrain from doing a classic gulp at his look, but the thin teen could not help himself and did it anyways. Again, Flash noticed, and a grin formed across his face as he slipped past their teacher to reach Peter and Ned. "What's with that look, penis?" he asked. It seemed that he did not care if anyone heard him say that to a fellow classmate. Well, it was that, or he was too stupid to realize that Erin or Mr. Johnson could have easily heard him say such a thing. Neither did, however, and so Peter and Ned were left simply glaring at Flash as he tried to look intimidating by swinging an arm around Peter's shoulders. Remembering what Pepper had said before about how he needed to stand up for himself even if just a bit, he quickly twisted his shoulder away. Flash had put a bit of his weight upon Peter with the gesture, and so when Peter moved back like he did, Flash stumbled a bit as he tried to rebalance himself. The commotion from his small shout and the squeak of his shoes on the tiled floor had Erin and Mr. Johnson turning to see what happened. Their reactions soon had everyone else turning to see what caught the adults' attention. Ned had accidentally let a small laugh escape at Flash's action. Peter had stood there not knowing what to do with himself, and Flash had a flush to his face at having so many eyes on him that were a mixed bag of emotions. Their teacher finally took in the scene and turned to walk up to them. He grabbed Flash and Ned by their shoulders while he sent a stern look to Peter as he tilted his head, telling the teen to follow him as he walked back the way they came. It was only a few steps, but it put a bit of distance between them and the rest of the class. Erin also made sure to direct the rest of the group to the next window in hopes of continuing the tour. "Why is it whenever I am forced to see something going on, it always involved you three?" Mr. Johnson demanded after he released Ned and Flash. The three young men had no response to give that would make the situation any better. When it looked like he would wait until one of them spoke up, Mr. Johnson gave a deep sigh as he rubbed his forehead. "Look, I said on the bus ride here that I would not be having any funny business on this trip, and I meant it. But you three are very lucky because I am the only chaperone here right now. I can't force the three of you to leave this trip due to the lack of supervision to ensure that you would make it back safe, but that doesn't have to stop me from keeping track of this type of stuff. When we get back to school, you can bet that there will be consequences. As of now, it may only be a phone call to each of your guardians, but if this keeps up and you do something that cannot be taken back, you can bet that I will get the principal involved. Look, I understand that not everyone gets along, but you are currently in a very important place, so you three better shape up right this moment. Am I clear?" "Yes, Mr. Johnson." The three mumbled, thoroughly ashamed to be scolded like they were 8 instead of 18. The older man gave a hesitant nod before he beckoned them to head over to the rest of the class while he made sure to walk behind the three to make sure there were no actions done behind his back as they regrouped. A grumble accompanied a brief moment of shifting metal from above, and Peter could easily imagine Clint frowning at his science teacher's head. Peter secretly agreed, but he knew that his teacher was just trying to be fair, and the young hero could not blame him too much. He was typically a fair teacher indeed. He would probably hound Flash more if he knew just how much of a problem Flash was to people like Peter and Ned, but the bully was also a bit clever. It was never in the sense of he knew when to keep his mouth and thoughts to himself, but Peter had to reluctantly see that Flash was smart when it came to him picking on others. He always made sure that there were no good camera angles in the school hallways and no teacher was looking their way in the classrooms. He may have been clever in that sense, but he was still as dumb as a bag of rocks when it came to him being able to control that mouth of his. That was a pleasant thought to Peter, since it meant those were the times when Flash was outed by himself for being his use of language to peers and teachers alike. His inner thoughts were interrupted then when Aaron ushered them to the end of the hall and turned to head down another. It was a bit more of the same things they had already witnessed, with various people in lab coats walking around behind glass looking all smart and important. It was fun to watch them, and the more that Peter gazed upon everything, the more excited he felt, since this could be him one day. Sure, he already technically worked here, but it was not like he was being paid. A lot of what he did was very beneficial for experience and being able to be in the presence of Tony Stark himself as well as all the heroes that he had admired all his life. Such things, however, did not help him and Aunt May pay for food, and so the sooner that he was able to graduate from high school, the sooner he would be able to apply to work at Stark Industries. A ping rang out in the hall, and Peter looked to see that Erin had taken out her phone and read something quickly before she pocketed it once more and left a relieved smile light her face. "Well," Erin said to interrupt Peter's thoughts once again, "that looks like that takes care of these halls. Why don't we head over to my own lab? It's not really my personal lab since everyone with a green or above may enter, but I am known to spend most of my time in there." A few excited words of agreement answered her. She looked down at her phone when there was a second ping, then said, "Okay, well then let's go. You'll be happy to know that you're getting another treat on this tour. I have to remind you to be very nice and on your best behavior. I don't want you embarrassing me in front of who we are about to meet, alright?" The energy of the group seemed even more eager, if that was possible. The best friends traded a happy look too, curious about who might be there. Peter never once considered that it might be someone he already knew. "No way," Shani whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Everyone seemed to simultaneously nod their head at her words, agreeing with her. Peter was included in that action, even though the people behind the glass were very familiar to him. Almost too familiar that he wanted to turn tail and bail out of there before he could be seen. The two that were currently sitting in Aaron's lab were by no means the eager or energetic heroes in attitude, but that did not mean that they would not try to whoop some bully butt if they caught Flash doing something. They were clever and quiet. They knew what signs to look for, and even though Peter would love it if they did something about that topic, it did not stop Peter from wanting to leave while he could, so that he would not have to look at the two as they gave their painfully and effective, disappointed fatherly kinds of expressions should they catch even the smallest detail. "Cool, right?" Aaron asked with a grin. "Come on you guys, let's get a closer look at the space and what those two are up to in there." Peter took a breath and let out a deep sigh as Aaron swiped her badge across the scanner to open the door. The protective glass doors opened to a small quarantine space with a few hazmat suits, gas masks, and medical masks hanging on one side of the space. Aaron gestured to the items and said that they were only there as a precaution but had never had to wear any of it herself. She ushered everyone in at once, explaining that the second set of doors would only open into the lab when the first set were closed tight. With a sort of whistle sound, the front set of doors finally sealed closed, and right away, they spilled out into the lab itself. Peter made sure to stay near the back so that he would be caught easily. Ned gave a confused look to him, but eventually made his way to stand by his side. Chocolate brown eyes, hidden behind a pair of thin glasses, were the first to look up from their work and spotted the group of teenagers easily. He gave off a nervous air, but the smile was genuine as he set down tools and stood from his stool to walk up and greet the group as a whole. "Well, hello there," Bruce Banner said as he stuffed his nervous hands in his lab coat pockets. "You guys are Aaron's tour group, right?" Only a few were able to verbally say anything to the genius, but most of the group in front of Peter at least nodded to let the scientist know that they had heard him. Aaron stepped forward with her own smile. "That's right, Dr. Banner. These little rascals are from Midtown High and are even part of the engineering program, so we might be seeing some familiar faces back here in a few more years." She turned to face the group and gave a wink. "Midtown?" Bruce asked with a raised eyebrow. Peter gave an internal gulp when he saw those cogs turning in the man's head as he began scanning the group of teenagers in front of him. Try as he might, Peter was not as hidden as he hoped to be when Bruce's striking eyes caught his own from where he stood just behind Ned's shoulder. The flash of surprise that passed through Bruce's face told Peter right away that the older hero had not previous knowledge that Peter would be taking a field trip of the SI Tower. Peter gave a guilty look when they locked eyes and hoped that he was pulling off a face that said he did not want to be outed. It seemed that Bruce understood the message, for as soon as he recovered from seeing Peter, he simply gave a nod to him in greeting before he turned away to head back to his workstation. "Well, don't be shy," he called over his shoulder. "Why don't you guys come over here and see what I've been up to? This is something that I'm sure you engineer students will enjoy." Everyone almost ran over Echoer in their hurry to follow the famous man, and if it was anyone else they were trailing after, Peter might have laughed at them. But this was Bruce freaking Banner, and even though Peter knew a bit more about the man than the average person, he could admit that he would give up an arm and a leg just to see the man in action. Speaking of an arm and a leg, it appeared that Bruce was working on some type of prosthetic, since there was a weird-looking arm that appeared to almost be a mix between hard plastic and some type of metal. It looked vaguely familiar, though Peter knew that he had never seen this kind of style for any prosthetic before. But he could easily guess who it was for, seeing as the thing had a left hand at the end of the appendage. As if waiting for that thought to pass through Peter's mind, a second person in the room, that the teen had not yet spotted, shifted just slightly. Then Peter easily caught the motion from his peripheral, and had he been alone without so many eyes on him, he might have overreacted and jumped onto the ceiling. Instead, however, all Peter could do was tense up in surprise, while a few of the classmates around him either jumped or shrieked in surprise. The teenage hero swung his eyes around to get a good look at the person who had startled them all, and was met with the very familiar and brooding face of one James Bucky Barnes. He was seated at a small table in the corner of the lab, that did not have as much light as the rest of the place for some reason, and the motion that he had made that alerted everyone of his presence was him setting down a reading tablet that he had been holding with one hand. His other hand was missing. In fact, his whole usual metal arm was gone, and instead a black piece of cloth was wrapped around his shoulder to hide away what his skin looked like underneath. Peter had never spotted what his injury looked like before, and seeing almost vulnerable in that situation made him both curious and protective. Suddenly, Peter wanted to push everyone else out of the room so that only the two of them and Bruce were left. He did not want so many curious peers hounding Bucky and making him even more anxious than he already usually was. He, of course, did not react on his thought, but all the same, he kept shooting a concerned look to the long-haired brunette as he tried to focus back on Bruce. "Sorry about that, guys, I probably that he was over there." Bruce looked over to Bucky as well and gave a smile and nod before he turned back to the arm he had been working on. "Anyways, as you can obviously tell now, this here is a new arm that I am working on for Mr. Quiet over there." "So cool," Kevin said as he leaned forward farther than everyone else. He did not try touch anything, but he looked the most eager out of everyone there to see all the parts up close. Bruce laughed at those words. "Yes, I like to think it's pretty cool as well. I've been tinkering with this idea for a while now and thought that it was about time that I start actually building a prototype for Bucky to try out." The more he spoke about it, the more eager Bruce seemed as well, and he joined Kevin in leaning over the arm. "See this here?" Bruce said as he tapped the fake bicep. "I'm planning to make it more durable while also being flexible like an actual muscle. This one is not really going to be going out on missions and fights, but more like a real arm for everyday use." He opened his mouth after taking a breath after saying everything in one breath, but Aaron gave a soft cough to grab his attention. He stuttered a bit as he tried to stop talking all at once, and his words jumbled together. Samantha and Casey giggled a bit when a small blush bloomed across the older Mont's face, But even the more level-headed girls like Shani and Catalina Vega joined in after making weird goo-goo eyes at the scientist. They seemed to take a moment to catch their breath form their not-so-well-hidden laughs, but when they did, Aaron spoke up again. "I'm sorry, Dr. Banner, I didn't mean to make you stop talking, but I just wanted to say that I have been trying to have them do a bit of guesswork on their own and think about what things around here might be used for or what they are made of. Would it be possible to do that sort of thing with this arm, or is it a bit more confidential?" "Oh, don't worry about that, Dr. White," Bruce said as he leaned down again to pat the fake arm almost affectionately. "If this was something top secret, I would have made sure to lock it up before you and your group arrived. I was already working on this here before I learned about you guys coming, so it's alright with me." "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry, Dr. Banner. I had no idea that you had booked some time in here. If I had, I swear that I would not have brought along a crowd here." "Hey, it's alright. I don't mind, and I'm sure Bucky doesn't either." He turned around to find Bucky where he had been before. "Well, as much as he cannot mind." Bruce gave a breathy laugh as he rubbed at the back of his head as he turned back to Aaron. Peter looked behind Bruce when he had turned and saw that Bucky had indeed stayed where he had been when the tour group arrived. He was no longer trying to read whatever was on his tablet and was instead eyeing the group of teenagers with an expression that Peter could not quite figure out. What Peter could easily tell, however, was the look that those piercing blue eyes were giving him. Apparently, he had easily located Peter within the group and he was now looking at nothing but Peter's face. It was a bit uncomfortable to be stared at with such a strong presence, but at the same time, Peter was familiar with Bucky and he knew that the soldier was not trying to be rude or intimidating in his stare. Bucky was most likely simply trying to find familiarity in the room since he was now technically outnumbered. They both knew that there were plenty of reasons why he did not have to worry about such thing like being attacked right now by the people who were occupying the same space as him, but Peter still understood regardless. The soldier-turned-hero was simply used to certain things still even after a few years of being completely free. Things like being aware of his surroundings and all possible exit strategies, best ways to attack, or even knowing who to go for first, were instincts within Bucky that had not gone away yet. Peter understood that Bucky was trying his best to keep cool, and so he was staring at one of the two people in the room that he was familiar and comfortable with. A ghost of a smile grew on Peter's lips at the thought. He very much enjoyed Bucky's company. He was a sturdy man in both company and physicality, so if Peter ever just needed a presence to keep in company or to feel safe, he could always count on the quiet man to be there. It was mostly due to him that Peter and Steve even became as close as they were. Peter was reluctant to admit it after 2 years having come and gone, but there had definitely been a time where his fondness for Captain America was lacking thanks to Iron Man's recruitment of him back when they all battled each other outside of an airport. After that had all been said and done, along with the terrifying battle against Thanos, the unlikely friendship between Winter Soldier and Spider-Man was formed. Peter was almost as close Bucky as he was with Tony. Bruce spoke up then, making Peter turn his eyes away from the man in the corner to focus back on the one speaking. "Well, since I've told you guys how I want this one to be used, do any of you have any ideas about what materials I used?" There were a few seconds of silence as Peter and his classmates leaned closer to the arm to get a good look at what it was, poking and prodding it a bit after Bruce gave the go-ahead. "Well, if you were working on the bicep before we arrived, then I can only assume that it will at least be a type of bendable material," Samantha said. "Like a rubber band," Jason added. Bruce gave a smile with a nod for them to continue. "Then it has to be a type of silicone," Peter said after moved around the workstation, closer to Bruce, and touched the arm. "A really strong one that won't disintegrate or be too difficult to mold or shift around. If it's going to be used like a muscle, then that makes the most sense. At least to me." Bruce gave a grin at those words, letting his eyes light up behind his glasses as he looked to Peter. "All three of you are correct. It is in fact a silicone-based material so that the entire thing will not become weak easily while also being able to maintain a bit of flexibility for the wearer to move however they want. It is for everyday use like I said earlier. So too much overwork and it might break down." "What about the rest of the arm? What's that made of?" Sean asked as he knocked a knuckle against the white, hard surface of the forearm. "Well, why don't you take a guess?" Bruce said with a smile and looked to Aaron. It seemed that Bruce was also finding it to be fun to see what the students on the tour could answer themselves. Sean hesitated before saying, Well, it has to be some type of polyester at least. You halfway there. Anyone else want to take crack at it? May I lift it to test its weight? Shani asked as she stepped forward to the edge of the table. When Bruce gave the go-ahead, she lifted the arm with both hands and made a few up and down motions as she got used to the mass. She tilted it around a few ways and even looked closer at the wrist and fingers as she delicately moved them around by their awkward joints. Please be careful with those. This is a fist prototype after all, and some of the fingers might not be on as strong as they should. Shani gave an understanding nod of her head as she went back to fiddling with the prosthetic. It's lightweight like something like this should be. But it also had a bit more weight to it. My best bet is that this is made from two materials that are common in this kind of creation. Perhaps epoxy is also being used to make the arm a bit heavier. You both are correct. This is being made out of two common plastic polymers, polyester and epoxy. That is making it a few more milligrams heavier. But there is also a bit of metal in the joints. It is to both to help keep the joints locked when the wearing wants them to be, like holding a cup, and to make sure that the different types of joints are stable. But want a metal corrode or become ruhot? The corrosion is something that can't be avoided, I'm afraid, but the metal being used is aluminum. So there is no risk of rust, and if you guys will remember, I said that this is for everyday use. Yes, that may mean that it will be worn a lot and that corrosion might happen sooner rather than later, but I am also hoping that when this will be in use, it will be indoors and for the more relaxing part of the days. There is no working out while wearing this, and there is no way that I will let this be worn for missions. Here, Bruce turned slightly to give a playful glare over Peter's head at the other older man in the room. A flash of surprise washed over his face before it went back to his usually brainy self when in the presence of one of his projects. Peter noticed the brief look, and being curious, he turned around, expecting to see Bucky still brooding in his corner, but was instead surprised to see that he was now standing almost directly behind Peter. He clammed down just as quickly as Bruce, knowing that there was no reason to be worried or tense. His spider sense had not even gone off either. And why should it have? Bucky was not any kind of threat at all. He still had a blank face as he looked down at Peter, however. His mouth was a thin, straight line, but at least his eyes were alive and swimming with mirth at the honor of startling Peter. Bucky then looked away from the teen hero to instead address Bruce. Peter turned around then, happy to feel the comforting presence of Bucky at his back, to see the rest of his class looking surprised. He lifted an eyebrow in confusion, and Jason answered. Dude, he was just sitting there like a second ago. I was facing him, and then after just a blink, he was right there behind you. Oh, well, he is an Avenger. It makes sense for him to be fast, right? I guess so. Bucky spoke up then, silencing Peter before he could anything else. Well, if you're done talking, how about we test this thing out already? Right now? Are you sure? It was obvious Bruce was asking for Bucky's sake to make sure he was alright with setting up a new arm with so many people in the room. Bucky gave a short nod of his head and he walked over to another table that had been set up. He made sure to turn his body so that his right side was facing the small crowd and began unstrapping the cloth covering his left shoulder. Well, it looks like you guys will get to see how well this first prototype will go. Who knows, maybe you guys can help me figure out what things can be improved, scrapped, or added. Bruce picked up the prosthetic and followed after Bucky. A few curious students tried to trail along as well, but Aaron and Mr. Johnson were there to stop them with a hand to their shoulders. They were sensitive enough to understand that Bucky had silently asked for some personal space.